opened the envelope. There was a long letter enclosed in the handwriting unknown to him. He read aloud the first lines of the letter. I write what I saw and post it tonight, so that no one may be before me with the news. I will come over tomorrow for the money. A low exclamation from Hanaud interrupted the words. The signature, quick! Ricardo turned to the end of the letter. Marthe Gobin. She speaks, then. After all, she speaks, Hanaud whispered in a voice of awe. He ran to the door of the room, opened it suddenly, and shutting it again locked it. Quick! We cannot bring that poor woman back to life, but we may still... He did not finish his sentence. He took the letter unceremoniously from Ricardo's hand and seated himself at the table. Over his shoulder, Mr. Ricardo, too, read Marthe Gobin's letter. It was just the sort of letter which, in Ricardo's view, Marthe Gobin would have written, a long, straggling letter which never kept to the point, which exasperated them one moment by its folly and fired them to excitement the next. It was dated from a small suburb of Geneva on the western side of the lake, and it ran as follows. The suburb is but a street close to the lakeside, and a tram runs into the city. It is quite respectable, you understand, monsieur, with a hotel at the end of it, and really some very good houses. But I do not wish to deceive you about the social position of myself or my husband. Our house is on the wrong side of the street? Definitely, yes. It is a small house, and we do not see the water from any of the windows because of the better houses opposite. Monsieur Gobin, my husband, who was a clerk in one of the great banks in Geneva, broke down in health in the spring, and for the last 3 months has been compelled to keep indoors. Of course, money has not been plentiful, and I could not afford a nurse. Consequently, I myself have been compelled to nurse him. Monsieur, if you were a woman, you would know what men are when they are ill, how fretful, how difficult. There is not much distraction for the woman who nurses them. So, as I am in the house most of the day, I find what amusement I can in watching the doings of my neighbours. You will not blame me. A month ago the house almost directly opposite to us was taken furnished for the summer by a Madame Rossignol. She is a widow, but during the last fortnight a young gentleman has come several times in the afternoon to see her, and it is said in the street that he is going to marry her. But I cannot believe it myself. Monsieur is a young man of perhaps 30, with smooth black hair. He wears a moustache, a little black moustache, and is altogether captivating. Madame Rossignol is 5 or 6 years older, I should think, a tall woman with red hair and a bold sort of coarse beauty. I was not attracted by her. She seemed not quite of the same world as that charming monsieur who is said to be going to marry her. No, I was not attracted by Adèle Rossignol. And when he had come to that point, Hanaud looked up with a start. So the name was Adèle, he whispered. Yes, said Ricardo. Hélène Vauquier spoke the truth. Hanaud nodded with a queer smile upon his lips. Yes, there she spoke the truth. I thought she did. But she said Adèle's hair was black, interposed Mr. Ricardo. Yes, there she didn't, said Hanaud dryly, and his eyes dropped again to the paper. I knew her name was Adèle, for often I have heard her servant calling her so, and without any madame in front of the name. That is strange, is it not, to hear an elderly servant woman calling after her mistress, Adèle, just simple Adèle? It was that which made me think monsieur and madame were not of the same world. But I do not believe that they are going to be married. I have an instinct about it. Of course one never knows with what extraordinary women the nicest men will fall in love. So that after all these two may get married. But if they do, I do not think they will be happy. Besides the old woman, there was another servant, a man, Hippolyte, who served in the house and drove the carriage when it was wanted. A respectable man. He always touched his hat when Madame Rossignol came out of the house. He slept in the house at night, although the stable was at the end of the street. I thought he was probably the son of Jeanne, the servant woman. He was young, and his hair was plastered down upon his forehead, and he was altogether satisfied with himself, and a great favourite amongst the servants of the street. The carriage and the horse were hired from Geneva. That is the household of Madame Rossignol. So far Mr. Ricardo read in silence. Then he broke out again. But we have them. The red-haired woman called Adèle, the man with the little black moustache. It was he who drove the motor car." Hanaud held up his hand to check the flow of words, and both read on again. "At 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, Madame was driven away in the carriage, and I did not see it return all that evening. Of course, it may have returned to the stables by another road, but it was not unusual for the carriage to take her into Geneva and wait a long time. I went to bed at 11, but in the night Monsieur Gobin was restless, and I rose to get him some medicine. We slept in the front of the house, monsieur, and while I was searching for the matches upon the table in the middle of the room, I heard the sound of carriage wheels in the silent street. I went to the window, and raising a corner of the curtains, looked out. Monsieur Gobin called to me fretfully from the bed to know why I did not light the candle and get him what he wanted. I have already told you how fretful sick men can be, always complaining if just for a minute one distracts oneself by looking out of the window. But there, one could do nothing to please them. Yet how right I was to raise the blind and look out of the window, for if I had obeyed my husband I might have lost 4,000 francs, and 4,000 francs are not to be sneezed at by a poor woman whose husband lies in bed. I saw the carriage stop at Madame Rossignol's house. Almost at once the house door was opened by the old servant, although the hall of the house and all the windows in the front were dark. That was the first thing that surprised me. For when Madame came home late and the house was dark, she used to let herself in with a latchkey. Now, in the dark house in the early morning, a servant was watching for them. It was strange. As soon as the door of the house was opened, the door of the carriage opened too, and a young lady stepped quickly out onto the pavement. The train of her dress caught in the door, and she turned round, stooped, freed it with her hand, and held it up off the ground. The night was clear, and there was a lamp in the street close by the door of Madame Rossignol's house. As she turned, I saw her face under the big green hat. It was very pretty and young, and the hair was fair. She wore a white coat, but it was open in front, and showed her evening frock of pale green. When she lifted her skirt, I saw the buckles sparkling on her satin shoes. It was the young lady for whom you are advertising, I am sure. She remained standing just for a moment without moving, while Madame Rossignol got out. I was surprised to see a young lady of such distinction in Madame Rossignol's company. Then, still holding her skirt up, she ran very lightly and quickly across the pavement into the dark house. I thought, monsieur, that she was very anxious not to be seen. So when I saw your advertisement, I was certain that this was the young lady for whom you are searching. I waited for a few moments and saw the carriage drive off towards the stable at the end of the street. But no light went up in any of the rooms in front of the house. And Monsieur Gobin was so fretful that I dropped the corner of the blind, lit the candle, and gave him his cooling drink. His watch was on the table at the bedside, and I saw that it was 5 minutes to 3. I will send you a telegram tomorrow, as soon as I am sure at what hour I can leave my husband. Accept, monsieur, I beg you, my most distinguished salutations. Marthe Gobin. Hanaud leant back with an extraordinary look of perplexity upon his face. But to Ricardo the whole story was now clear. Here was an independent witness, without the jealousy or rancours of Hélène Vauquier. Nothing could be more damning than her statement. It corroborated those footmarks upon the soil in front of the glass door of the salon. There was nothing to be done except to set about arresting Mademoiselle Celie at once. The facts work with your theory, Monsieur Hanaud. The young man with the black moustache did not return to the house at Geneva, for somewhere upon the road close to Geneva he met the carriage. He was driving back the car to Aix. And then another thought struck him. "But no," he cried, "we are altogether wrong. See, they did not reach home until 5 minutes to 3. 5 minutes to 3? But this demolished the whole of Hanaud's theory about the motor car. The murderers had left the villa between 11 and 12, probably before 11:30. The car was a machine of 60 horsepower, and the roads were certain to be clear. Yet the travellers only reached their home at 3. Moreover, the car was back in Aix at 4. It was evident they did not travel by the car. "Geneva time is an hour later than French time," said Hanaud shortly. It seemed as if the corroboration of this letter disappointed him. 3:15 in Madame Gobin's house would be 2:45 by our watches here. Hanaud folded up the letter and rose to his feet. "We will go now, and we will take this letter with us." Hanaud looked about the room and picked up a glove lying upon a table. "I left this behind me," he said, putting it into his pocket. "By the way, where is the telegram from Marthe Gobin?" "You put it in your letter case." "Oh, did I?" Hanaud took out his letter case and found the telegram within it. His face lightened. "Good," he said emphatically. "For since we have this telegram, there must have been another message sent from Adèle Rossignol to Aix, saying that Marthe Gobin, that busybody, that inquisitive neighbour, who had no doubt seen Monsieur Ricardo's advertisement, was on her way hither. Oh, it will not be put as crudely as that, but that is what the message will mean. We shall have him." And suddenly his face grew very stern. "I must catch him. For Marthe Gobin's death I cannot forgive. A poor woman meaning no harm, and murdered like a sheep under our noses. No, that I cannot forgive." Ricardo wondered whether it was the actual murder of Marthe Gobin, or the fact that he had been beaten and outwitted, which Hanaud could not forgive. But discretion kept him silent. "Let us go," said Hanaud. "By the lift, if you please. It will save time." They descended into the hall close by the main door. The body of Marthe Gobin had been removed to the mortuary of the town. The life of the hotel had resumed its course. "Monsieur Besnard has gone, I suppose?" Hanaud asked of the porter, and receiving an assent, he walked quickly out of the front door. "But there is a shorter way," said Ricardo, running after him, "across the garden at the back and down the steps." "It will make no difference now," said Hanaud. They hurried along the drive and down the road which circled round the hotel and dipped to the town. Behind Hanaud's hotel, Ricardo's car was waiting. "We must go first to Besnard's office. The poor man will be at his wits' end to know who was Madame Gobin and what brought her to Aix. Besides, I wish to send a message over the telephone." Hanaud descended and spent a quarter of an hour with the commissaire. As he came out, he looked at his watch. "We shall be in time, I think," he said. He climbed into the car. "The murder of Marthe Gobin on her way from the station will put our friends at their ease. It will be published, no doubt, in the evening papers, and those good people over there in Geneva will read it with amusement. They do not know that Marthe Gobin wrote a letter yesterday night. Come, let us go." "Where to?" asked Ricardo. "Where to?" exclaimed Hanaud. "Why, of course to Geneva." End of chapter 11. Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. The Aluminium Flask. "I have telephoned to Le Maire, the chef de la Sûreté at Geneva," said Hanaud, as the car sped out of Aix along the road to Annecy. "He will have the house watched. We shall be in time. They will do nothing until dark." But though he spoke confidently, there was a note of anxiety in his voice, and he sat forward in the car as though he were already straining his eyes to see Geneva. Ricardo was a trifle disappointed. They were on the great journey to Geneva. They were going to arrest Mademoiselle Celie and her accomplices, and Hanaud had not come disguised. Hanaud, in Ricardo's eyes, was hardly living up to the dramatic expedition on which they had set out. It seemed to him that there was something incorrect in the great detective coming out on the chase without a false beard. "But, my dear friend, why shouldn't I?" pleaded Hanaud. "We are going to dine together at the Restaurant du Nord over the lake until it grows dark. It is not pleasant to eat one's soup in a false beard. Have you tried it? Besides, everybody stares so, seeing perfectly well that it is false. Now, I do not want tonight that people should know me for a detective, so I do not go disguised." "Humorist," said Mr. Ricardo. "There, you have found me out," cried Hanaud in mock alarm. "Besides, I told you this morning that that is precisely what I am." Beyond Annecy they came to the bridge over the ravine. At the far end of it the car stopped. A question, a hurried glance into the body of the car, and the officers of the customs stood aside. "You see how perfunctory it is," said Hanaud, and with a jerk the car moved on. The jerk threw Hanaud against Mr. Ricardo. Something hard in the detective's pocket knocked against his companion. "You have got them?" he whispered. "What?" "The handcuffs." Another disappointment awaited Ricardo. A detective without a false beard was bad enough, but that was nothing to a detective without handcuffs. The paraphernalia of justice were sadly lacking. However, Hanaud consoled Mr. Ricardo by showing him the hard thing. It was almost as thrilling as the handcuffs, for it was a loaded revolver. "There will be danger, then," said Ricardo with a tremor of excitement. "I should have brought mine." "There would have been danger, my friend," Hanaud objected gravely, "if you had brought yours." They reached Geneva as the dusk was falling, and drove straight to the restaurant by the side of the lake, and mounted to the balcony on the first floor. A small, stout man sat at a table alone in a corner of the balcony. He rose and held out his hands. "My friend, Monsieur le Maire, the chef de la Sûreté of Geneva," said Hanaud, presenting the little man to his companion. There were as yet only two couples dining in the restaurant, and Hanaud spoke so that neither could overhear him. He sat down at the table. "What news?" he asked. "None," said le Maire. "No one has come out of the house. No one has gone in." "And if anything happens while we dine?" "We shall know," said le Maire. "Look, there is a man loitering under the trees there. He will strike a match to light his pipe." The hurried conversation was ended. "Good," said Hanaud. "We will dine then, and be gay." He called to the waiter and ordered dinner. It was after 7 when they sat down to dinner, and they dined while the dusk deepened. In the street below the lights flashed out, throwing a sheen on the foliage of the trees at the water's side. Upon the dark lake the reflections of lamps rippled and shook. A boat in which musicians sang to music passed by with a cool splash of oars. The green and red lights of the launches glided backwards and forwards. Hanaud alone, of the party on the balcony, tried to keep the conversation upon a light and general level, but it was plain that even he was overdoing his gaiety. There were moments when a sudden contraction of the muscles would clench his hands and give a spasmodic jerk to his shoulders. He was waiting uneasily, uncomfortably, until darkness should come. "Eat," he cried, "eat, my friends," playing with his own barely tasted food. And then, at a sentence from le Maire, his knife and fork clattered on his plate, and he sat with a face suddenly grown white. For le Maire said, as though it was no more than a matter of ordinary comment, "So Madame Dauvray's jewels were, after all, never stolen?" Hanaud started. "You know that? How did you know it?" "It was in this evening's paper. I bought one on the way here. They were found under the floor of the bedroom." And even as he spoke a newsboy's voice rang out in the street below them. Le Maire was alarmed by the look on his friend's face. "Does it matter, Hanaud?" he asked with some solicitude. "It matters," and Hanaud rose up abruptly. The boy's voice sounded louder in the street below. The words became distinct to all upon that balcony. "The Aix murder! Discovery of the jewels!" "We must go," Hanaud whispered hoarsely. "Here are life and death in the balances, I believe, and there," he pointed down to the little group gathering about the newsboy under the trees, "there is the command which way to tip the scales." "It was not I who sent it," said Ricardo eagerly. He had no precise idea what Hanaud meant by his words, but he realized that the sooner he exculpated himself from the charge, the better. "Of course it was not you. I know that very well," said Hanaud. He called for the bill. "When is that paper published?" "At 7, said le Maire. "They have been crying it in the streets of Geneva, then, for more than half an hour." He sat drumming impatiently upon the table until the bill should be brought. "By heaven, that's clever," he muttered savagely. "There's a man who gets ahead of me at every turn. See, le Maire, I take every care, every precaution, that no message shall be sent. I let it be known, I take careful pains to let it be known, that no message can be sent without detection following, and here's the message sent by the one channel I never thought to guard against and stop. Look." The murder at the Villa Rose and the mystery which hid its perpetration had aroused interest. This new development had quickened it. From the balcony Hanaud could see the groups thickening about the boy and the white sheets of the newspaper in the hands of passers-by. Everyone in Geneva or near Geneva will know of this message by now." "Who could have told?" asked Ricardo blankly, and Hanaud laughed in his face, but laughed without any merriment. "At last," he cried, as the waiter brought the bill, and just as he had paid it, the light of a match flared up under the trees. "The signal," said Le Maire. "Not too quickly," whispered Hanaud. With as much unconcern as each could counterfeit, the three men descended the stairs and crossed the road. Under the trees a fourth man joined them, he who had lighted his pipe. "The coachman, Hippolyte," he whispered, "bought an evening paper at the front door of the house from a boy who came down the street shouting the news. The coachman ran back into the house." "When was this?" asked Le Maire. The man pointed to a lad who leaned against the balustrade above the lake, hot and panting for breath. "He came on his bicycle. He has just arrived." "Follow me," said Le Maire. 6 yards from where they stood, a couple of steps led down from the embankment onto a wooden landing stage where boats were moored. Le Maire, followed by the others, walked briskly down onto the landing stage. An electric launch was waiting. It had an awning and was of the usual type which one hires at Geneva. There were 2 sergeants in plain clothes on board, and a third man whom Ricardo recognized. "That is the man who found out in whose shop the cord was bought," he said to Hanaud. "Yes, it is Durette. He has been here since yesterday." Le Maire and the 3 who followed him stepped into it, and it backed away from the stage and, turning, sped swiftly towards Geneva. The gay lights of the shops and the restaurants were left behind. The cool darkness enveloped them. A light breeze blew over the lake. A trail of white and tumbled water lengthened out behind and overhead. In a sky of deepest blue, the bright stars shone like gold. "If only we are in time," said Hanaud, catching his breath. "Yes," answered Le Maire, and in both their voices there was a strange note of gravity. Le Maire gave a signal after a while, and the boat turned to the shore and reduced its speed. They had passed the big villas. On the bank the gardens of houses, narrow, long gardens of a street of small houses, reached down to the lake, and to almost each garden there was a rickety landing stage of wood projecting into the lake. Again Le Maire gave a signal, and the boat's speed was so much reduced that not a sound of its coming could be heard. It moved over the water like a shadow, with not so much as a curl of white at its bows. Le Maire touched Hanaud on the shoulder and pointed to a house in a row of houses. All the windows except 2 upon the second floor and 1 upon the ground floor were in absolute darkness, and over those upper 2 the wooden shutters were closed. But in the shutters there were diamond-shaped holes, and from these holes 2 yellow beams of light, like glowing eyes upon the watch, streamed out and melted in the air. "You are sure that the front of the house is guarded?" asked Hanaud anxiously. "Yes," replied Le Maire. Ricardo shivered with excitement. The launch slid noiselessly into the bank and lay hidden under its shadow. Hanaud turned to his associates with his finger to his lips. Something gleamed darkly in his hand. It was the barrel of his revolver. Cautiously the men disembarked and crept up the bank. First came Le Maire, then Hanaud. Ricardo followed him, and the fourth man, who had struck the match under the trees, brought up the rear. The other 3 officers remained in the boat. Stooping under the shadow of the side wall of the garden, the invaders stole towards the house. When a bush rustled or a tree whispered in the light wind, Ricardo's heart jumped to his throat. Once Le Maire stopped, as though his ears heard a sound which warned him of danger. Then cautiously he crept on again. The garden was a ragged place of unmown lawn and straggling bushes. Behind each one Mr. Ricardo seemed to feel an enemy. Never had he been in so strait a predicament. He, the cultured host of Grosvenor Square, was creeping along under a wall with continental policemen. He was going to raid a sinister house by the Lake of Geneva. It was thrilling. Fear and excitement gripped him in turn and let him go, but always he was sustained by the pride of the man doing an out-of-the-way thing. If only my friends could see me now. The ancient vanity was loud in his bosom. Poor fellows, they were upon yachts in the Solent, or on grouse moors in Scotland, or on golf links at North Berwick. He alone of all of them was tracking malefactors to their doom by Lemon's Lake. From these agreeable reflections, Ricardo was shaken. Le Maire stopped. The raiders had reached the angle made by the side wall of the garden and the house. A whisper was exchanged, and the party turned and moved along the house wall towards the lighted window on the ground floor. As Le Maire reached it, he stooped. Then slowly his forehead and his eyes rose above the sill and glanced this way and that into the room. Mr. Ricardo could see his eyes gleaming as the light from the window caught them. His face rose completely over the sill. He stared into the room without care or apprehension, then dropped again out of the reach of the light. He turned to Hanaud. "The room is empty," he whispered. Hanaud turned to Ricardo. "Pass under the sill, or the light from the window will throw your shadow upon the lawn." The party came to the back door of the house. Le Maire tried the handle of the door, and to his surprise it yielded. They crept into the passage. The last man closed the door noiselessly, locked it, and removed the key. A panel of light shone upon the wall a few paces ahead. The door of the lighted room was open. As Ricardo stepped silently past it, he looked in. It was a parlour meanly furnished. Hanaud touched him on the arm and pointed to the table. Ricardo had seen the objects at which Hanaud pointed often enough without uneasiness, but now, in this silent house of crime, they had the most sinister and appalling aspect. There was a tiny phial half full of a dark brown liquid. Beside it a little leather case lay open, and across the case, ready for use or waiting to be filled, was a bright morphia needle. Ricardo felt the cold creep along his spine and shivered. "Come," whispered Hanaud. They reached the foot of a flight of stairs and cautiously mounted it. They came out in a passage which ran along the side of the house from the back to the front. It was unlighted, but they were now on the level of the street, and a fan-shaped glass window over the front door admitted a pale light. There was a street lamp near to the door, Ricardo remembered, for by the light of it Marthe de Cobin had seen Celia Harland run so nimbly into this house. For a moment the men in the passage held their breath. Someone strode heavily by on the pavement outside. To Mr. Ricardo's ear, a most companionable sound. Then a clock upon a church struck the half-hour musically, distantly. It was 8:30, and a second afterwards a tiny bright light shone. Hanaud was directing the light of a pocket electric torch to the next flight of stairs. Here the stairs were carpeted, and once more the men crept up. One after another they came out upon the next landing. It ran, like those below it, along the side of the house from the back to the front, and the doors were all upon their left hand. From beneath the door nearest to them a yellow line of light streamed out. They stood in the darkness, listening, but not a sound came from behind the door. Was this room empty too? In each one's mind was the fear that the birds had flown. Le Maire carefully took the handle of the door and turned it. Very slowly and cautiously he opened the door. A strong light beat out through the widening gap upon his face. And then, though his feet did not move, his shoulders and his face drew back. The action was significant enough. This room, at all events, was not empty, but of what Le Maire saw in the room, his face gave no hint. He opened the door wider, and now Hanaud saw. Ricardo, trembling with excitement, watched him. But again there was no expression of surprise, consternation, or delight. He stood stolidly and watched. Then he turned to Ricardo, placed a finger on his lips and made room. Ricardo crept on tiptoe to his side, and now he too could look in. He saw a brightly lit bedroom with a made bed. On his left were the shuttered windows overlooking the lake. On his right, in the partition wall, a door stood open. Through the door he could see a dark, windowless closet, with a small bed from which the bedclothes hung and trailed upon the floor, as though someone had been but now roughly dragged from it. On a table close by the door lay a big green hat with a brown ostrich feather and a white cloak. But the amazing spectacle which kept him riveted was just in front of him. An old hag of a woman was sitting in a chair with her back towards them. She was mending with a big needle the holes in an old sack, and while she bent over her work she crooned to herself some French song. Every now and then she raised her eyes, for in front of her, under her charge, Mademoiselle Celie, the girl of whom Hanaud was in search, lay helpless upon a sofa. The train of her delicate green frock swept the floor. She was dressed as Hélène Vauquier had described. Her gloved hands were tightly bound behind her back. Her feet were crossed so that she could not have stood, and her ankles were cruelly strapped together. Over her face and eyes a piece of coarse sacking was stretched like a mask, and the ends were roughly sewn together at the back of her head. She lay so still that but for the labouring of her bosom and a tremor which now and again shook her limbs, the watchers would have thought her dead. She made no struggle of resistance. She lay quiet and still. Once she writhed, but it was with the uneasiness of one in pain, and the moment she stirred, the old woman's hand went out to a bright aluminium flask which stood on a little table at her side. "Keep quiet, little one," she ordered, in a careless, chiding voice, and she rapped with the flask peremptorily upon the table. Immediately, as though the tapping had some strange message of terror for the girl's ear, she stiffened her whole body and lay rigid. "I am not ready for you yet, little fool," said the old woman, and she bent again to her work. Ricardo's brain whirled. Here was the girl whom they had come to arrest, who had sprung from the salon with so much activity of youth across the stretch of grass, who had run so quickly and lightly across the pavement into this very house so that she should not be seen. And now she was lying in her fine and delicate attire, a captive, at the mercy of the very people who were her accomplices. Suddenly a scream rang out in the garden, a shrill, loud scream close beneath the windows. The old woman sprang to her feet. The girl on the sofa raised her head. The old woman took a step towards the window, and then she swiftly turned towards the door. She saw the men upon the threshold. She uttered a bellow of rage. There was no other word to describe the sound. It was not a human cry. It was the bellow of an angry animal. She reached out her hand towards the flask, but before she could grasp it, Hanaud seized her. She burst into a torrent of foul oaths. Hanaud flung her across de Lemaire's officer, who dragged her from the room. "Quick," said Hanaud, pointing to the girl, who was now struggling helplessly upon the sofa. "Mademoiselle Celie." Ricardo cut the stitches of the sacking. Hanaud unstrapped her hands and feet. They helped her to sit up. She shook her hands in the air as though they tortured her, and then, in a piteous, whimpering voice like a child's, she babbled incoherently and whispered prayers. Suddenly the prayers ceased. She sat stiff, with eyes fixed and staring. She was watching Lemaire, and she was watching him fascinated with terror. He was holding in his hand the large, bright aluminium flask. He poured a little of the contents very carefully onto a piece of the sack, and then, with an exclamation of anger, he turned towards Hanaud. But Hanaud was supporting Celia, and so, as Lemaire turned abruptly towards him with the flask in his hand, he turned abruptly towards Celia too. She wrenched herself from Hanaud's arms. She shrank violently away. Her white face flushed scarlet and grew white again. She screamed loudly, terribly, and after the scream she uttered a strange, weak sigh, and so fell sideways in a swoon. Hanaud caught her as she fell. A light broke over his face. "Now I understand," he cried. "Good God, that's horrible." End of chapter 12. 13 of In the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, In the House at Geneva. It was well, Mr. Ricardo thought, that someone understood. For himself, he frankly admitted that he did not. Indeed, in his view, the first principles of reasoning seemed to be set at naught. It was obvious from the solicitude with which Celia Harland was surrounded that everyone except himself was convinced of her innocence. Yet it was equally obvious that anyone who bore in mind the 8 points he had tabulated against her must be convinced of her guilt. Yet again, if she were guilty, how did it happen that she had been so mishandled by her accomplices? He was not allowed, however, to reflect upon these remarkable problems. He had too busy a time of it. At one moment he was running to fetch water wherewith to bathe Celia's forehead. At another, when he had returned with the water, he was distracted by the appearance of Durette, the inspector from Aix, in the doorway. "We have them both," he said, "Hippolyte and the woman. They were hiding in the garden." "So I thought," said Hanaud, "when I saw the door open downstairs and the morphia needle on the table." Le Maire turned to one of the officers. "Let them be taken with old Jeanne in cabs to the depot." And when the man had gone upon his errand, Le Maire spoke to Hanaud. "You will stay here tonight to arrange for their transfer to Aix?" "I will leave Durette behind," said Hanaud. "I am needed at Aix. We will make a formal application for the prisoners." He was kneeling by Celia's side and awkwardly dabbing her forehead with a wet handkerchief. He raised a warning hand. Celia Harland moved and opened her eyes. She sat up on the sofa, shivering, and looked with dazed and wondering eyes from one to another of the strangers who surrounded her. She searched in vain for a familiar face. "You are amongst good friends, Mademoiselle Celie," said Hanaud with great gentleness. "Oh, I wonder," she cried piteously. "Be very sure of it," he said heartily, and she clung to the sleeve of his coat with desperate hands. "I suppose you are friends," she said, "else why?" And she moved her numbed limbs to make certain that she was free. She looked about the room. Her eyes fell upon the sack and widened with terror. "They came to me a little while ago in that cupboard there, Adèle and the old woman, Jeanne. They made me get up. They told me they were going to take me away. They brought my clothes and dressed me in everything I wore when I came, so that no single trace of me might be left behind. Then they tied me." She tore off her gloves and showed them her lacerated wrists. "I think they meant to kill me horribly." And she caught her breath and whimpered like a child. Her spirit was broken. "My poor girl, all that is over," said Hanaud, and he stood up. But at the first movement he made, she cried incisively, "No!" and tightened the clutch of her fingers upon his sleeve. "But, mademoiselle, you are safe," he said with a smile. She stared at him stupidly. It seemed the words had no meaning for her. She would not let him go. It was only the feel of his coat within the clutch of her fingers which gave her any comfort. "I want to be sure that I am safe," she said, with a wan little smile. "Tell me, mademoiselle, what have you had to eat and drink during the last 2 days?" "Is it 2 days?" she asked. "I was in the dark there. I did not know. A little bread, a little water." "That's what is wrong," said Hanaud. "Come, and let us go from here." "Yes, yes," Celia cried eagerly. She rose to her feet and tottered. Hanaud put his arm about her. "You are very kind," she said in a low voice, and again doubt looked out from her face and disappeared. "I am sure that I can trust you." Ricardo fetched her cloak and slipped it on her shoulders. Then he brought her hat and she pinned it on. She turned to Hanaud. Unconsciously familiar words rose to her lips. "Is it straight?" she asked. And Hanaud laughed outright, and in a moment Celia smiled herself. Supported by Hanaud, she stumbled down the stairs to the garden. As they passed the open door of the lighted parlour at the back of the house, Hanaud turned back to Le Maire and pointed silently to the morphia needle and the phial. Le Maire nodded his head, and going into the room took them away. They went out again into the garden. Celia Harland threw back her head to the stars and drew in a deep breath of the cool night air. "I did not think," she said in a low voice, "to see the stars again." They walked slowly down the length of the garden, and Hanaud lifted her into the launch. She turned and caught his coat. "You must come too," she said stubbornly. Hanaud sprang in beside her. "For tonight," he said gaily, "I am your papa." Ricardo and the others followed, and the launch moved out over the lake under the stars. The bow was turned towards Geneva. The water tumbled behind them like white fire. The night breeze blew fresh upon their faces. They disembarked at the landing stage, and then Le Maire bowed to Celia and took his leave. Hanaud led Celia up onto the balcony of the restaurant and ordered supper. There were people still dining at the tables. One party indeed sitting late over their coffee Ricardo recognized with a kind of shock. They had taken their places, the very places in which they now sat, before he and Hanaud and Le Maire had left the restaurant upon their expedition of rescue. Into that short interval of time So much that was eventful had been crowded. Hanaud leaned across the table to Celia and said in a low voice, "Mademoiselle, if I may suggest it, it would be as well if you put on your gloves, otherwise they may notice your wrists." Celia followed his advice. She ate some food and drank a glass of champagne. A little colour returned to her cheeks. "You are very kind to me, you and monsieur your friend," she said, with a smile towards Ricardo. "But for you—" and her voice shook. "Hush," said Hanaud. "All that is over. We will not speak of it." Celia looked out across the road onto the trees, of which the dark foliage was brightened and made pale by the lights of the restaurant. Out on the water someone was singing. "It seems impossible to me," she said in a low voice, "that I am here in the open air and free." Hanaud looked at his watch. "Mademoiselle Celie, it is past 10 o'clock. Monsieur Ricardo's car is waiting there under the trees. I want you to drive back to Aix. I have taken rooms for you at an hotel, and there will be a nurse from the hospital to look after you." "Thank you, monsieur," she said. "You have thought of everything. But I shall not need a nurse." "But you will have a nurse," said Hanaud firmly. "You feel stronger now, yes. But when you lay your head upon your pillow, mademoiselle, it will be a comfort for you to know that you have her within call. And in a day or two," he added gently, "you will perhaps be able to tell us what happened on Tuesday night at the Villa Rose?" Celia covered her face with her hands for a few moments. Then she drew them away and said simply, "Yes, monsieur, I will tell you." Hanaud bowed to her with a genuine deference. "Thank you, mademoiselle," he said, and in his voice there was a strong ring of sympathy. They went downstairs and entered Ricardo's motor car. "I want to send a telephone message," said Hanaud, "if you will wait here." "No!" cried Celia decisively, and she again laid hold of his coat with a pretty imperiousness, as though he belonged to her. "But I must," said Hanaud with a laugh. "Then I will come too," said Celia, and she opened the door and set a foot upon the step. "You will not, mademoiselle," said Hanaud with a laugh. "Will you take your foot back into that car? That is better. Now you will sit with your friend, Monsieur Ricardo, whom, by the way, I have not yet introduced to you. He is a very good friend of yours, mademoiselle, and will in the future be a still better one." Ricardo felt his conscience rather heavy within him, for he had come out to Geneva with the fixed intention of arresting her as a most dangerous criminal. Even now he could not understand how she could be innocent of a share in Madame Dauvray's murder. But Hanaud evidently thought she was, and since Hanaud thought so, why, it was better to say nothing if one was sensitive to jibes. So Ricardo sat and talked with her, while Hanaud ran back into the restaurant. It mattered very little, however, what he said, for Celia's eyes were fixed upon the doorway through which Hanaud had disappeared, and when he came back she was quick to turn the handle of the door. "Now, mademoiselle, we will wrap you up in Monsieur Ricardo's spare motor coat and cover your knees with a rug and put you between us, and then you can go to sleep." The car sped through the streets of Geneva. Celia Harland, with a little sigh of relief, nestled down between the two men. "If I knew you better," she said to Hanaud, "I should tell you, what of course I do not tell you now, that I feel as if I had a big Newfoundland dog with me." "Mademoiselle Celie," said Hanaud, and his voice told her that he was moved, "that is a very pretty thing which you have said to me." The lights of the city fell away behind them. Now only a glow in the sky spoke of Geneva. Now even that was gone, and with a smooth continuous purr the car raced through the cool darkness. The great headlamps threw a bright circle of light before them, and the road slipped away beneath the wheels like a running tide. Celia fell asleep. Even when the car stopped at the Pont de la Caille, she did not waken. The door was opened and a search for contraband was made. The book was signed. Still she did not wake. The car sped on. "You see, coming into France is a different affair," said Hanaud. "Yes," replied Ricardo. "Still, I will own it, you caught me napping yesterday." "I did?" exclaimed Ricardo joyfully. "You did," returned Hanaud. "I had never heard of the Pont de la Caille. But you will not mention it? You will not ruin me?" "I will not," answered Monsieur Ricardo, superb in his magnanimity. "You are a good detective." "Oh, thank you," cried Hanaud, in a voice which shook, surely with emotion. He wrung Ricardo's hand. He wiped an imaginary tear from his eye. And still Celia slept. Monsieur Ricardo looked at her. He said to Hanaud in a whisper: "Yet I do not understand. The car, though no serious search was made, must still have stopped at the Pont de la Caille on the Swiss side. Why did she not cry for help then? One cry and she was safe. A movement even was enough. Do you understand?" Hanaud nodded his head. "I think so," he answered, with a very gentle look at Celia. "Yes, I think so." When Celia was aroused, she found that the car had stopped before the door of an hotel, and that a woman in the dress of a nurse was standing in the doorway. "You can trust Marie," said Hanaud, and Celia turned as she stood upon the ground and gave her hands to the two men. Thank you both," she said in a trembling voice. She looked at Hanaud and nodded her head. "You understand why I thank you so very much?" "Yes," said Hanaud. "But mademoiselle," and he bent over the car and spoke to her quietly, holding her hand, "there is always a big Newfoundland dog in the worst of troubles, if only you will look for him. I tell you so, I who belong to the Sûreté in Paris. Do not lose heart." And in his mind he added, "God forgive me for the lie." He shook her hand and let it go, and gathering up her skirt she went into the hall of the hotel. Hanaud watched her as she went. She was to him a lonely and pathetic creature, in spite of the nurse who bore her company. "You must be a good friend to that young girl, Monsieur Ricardo," he said. "Let us drive to your hotel." "Yes," said Ricardo, and as they went the curiosity which all the way from Geneva had been smouldering within him burst into flame. "Will you explain to me one thing?" he asked. "When the scream came from the garden you were not surprised. Indeed, you said that when you saw the open door and the morphia needle on the table of the little room downstairs, you thought Adèle and the man Hippolyte were hiding in the garden." "Yes, I did think so." "Why? And why did the publication that the jewels had been discovered so alarm you?" "Ah," said Hanaud, "did you not understand that? Yet surely it is clear and obvious, if you once grant that the girl was innocent, was a witness of the crime, and was now in the hands of the criminals. Grant me those premises, Mr. Ricardo, for a moment, and you will see that we had just one chance of finding the girl alive in Geneva. From the first I was sure of that. What was the one chance? Why, this. She might be kept alive on the chance that she could be forced to tell what, by the way, she did not know, namely the place where Madame Dauvray's valuable jewels were secreted. Now follow this. We, the police, find the jewels and take charge of them. Let that news reach the house in Geneva, and on the same night Mademoiselle Celie loses her life, and not very pleasantly. They have no further use for her. She is merely a danger to them. So I take my precautions. Never mind for the moment what they were. I take care that if the murderer is in Aix and gets wind of our discovery, he shall not be able to communicate his news." "The post office would have stopped letters or telegrams," said Ricardo. "I understand." "On the contrary," replied Hanaud. "No, I took my precautions, which were of quite a different kind, before I knew the house in Geneva or the name of Rossignol. But one way of communication I did not think of. I did not think of the possibility that the news might be sent to a newspaper, which of course would publish it and cry it through the streets of Geneva. The moment I heard the news I knew we must hurry. The garden of the house ran down to the lake. A means of disposing of Mademoiselle Celie was close at hand, and the night had fallen. As it was, we arrived just in time, and no earlier than just in time. The paper had been bought, the message had reached the house. Mademoiselle Celie was no longer of any use, and every hour she stayed in that house was of course an hour of danger to her captors." "What were they going to do?" asked Ricardo. Hanaud shrugged his shoulders. "It is not pretty, what they were going to do. We reached the garden in our launch. At that moment Hippolyte and Adèle, who was most likely Hippolyte's wife, or in the lighted parlour on the basement floor. Adèle is preparing her morphia needle. Hippolyte is going to get ready the rowing boat, which was tied at the end of the landing stage. Quietly as we came into the bank, they heard or saw us. They ran out and hid in the garden, having no time to lock the garden door, or perhaps not daring to lock it lest the sound of the key should reach our ears. We find that door upon the latch, the door of the room open. On the table lies the morphia needle. Upstairs lies Mademoiselle Celie. She is helpless. She cannot see what they are meaning to do. But she could cry out, exclaimed Ricardo. She did not even do that. No, my friend, she could not cry out, replied Hanaud very seriously. I know why. She could not. No living man or woman could. Rest assured of that. Ricardo was mystified, but since the captain of the ship would not show his observation, he knew it would be in vain to press him. Well, while Adèle was preparing her morphia needle, and Hippolyte was about to prepare the boat, Jeanne upstairs was making her preparation too. She was mending a sack. Did you see Mademoiselle Celie's eyes and face when first she saw that sack? Ah, she understood. They meant to give her a dose of morphia, and as soon as she became unconscious they were going perhaps to take some terrible precaution. Hanaud paused for a second. I only say perhaps as to that. But certainly they were going to sew her up in that sack, row her well out across the lake, fix a weight to her feet, and drop her quietly overboard. She was to wear everything which she had brought with her to the house. Mademoiselle Celie would have disappeared for ever, and left not even a ripple upon the water to trace her by. Ricardo clenched his hands. "But that's horrible!" he cried, and as he uttered the words the car swerved into the drive and stopped before the door of the Hotel Majestic. Ricardo sprang out. A feeling of remorse seized hold of him. All through that evening he had not given one thought to Harry Wethermill, so utterly had the excitement of each moment engrossed his mind. "He will be glad to know," cried Ricardo. "To-night, at all events, he shall sleep. I ought to have telegraphed to him from Geneva that we and Miss Celia were coming back." He ran up the steps into the hotel. "I took care that he should know," said Hanaud, as he followed in Ricardo's steps. "Then the message could not have reached him, else he would have been expecting us," replied Ricardo, as he hurried into the office where a clerk sat at his books. "Is Mr. Wethermill in?" he asked. The clerk eyed him strangely. "Mr. Wethermill was arrested this evening," he said. Ricardo stepped back. "Arrested? When?" "At 10:25 replied the clerk shortly. "Ah," said Hanaud quietly, "that was my telephone message." Ricardo stared in stupefaction at his companion. "Arrested!" he cried. "Arrested? But what for?" "For the murders of Marthe Gobin and Madame Dauvray," said Hanaud. "Good night." End of chapter 13. At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. Mr. Ricardo is bewildered. Ricardo passed a most tempestuous night. He was tossed amongst dark problems. Now it was Harry Wethermill who beset him. He repeated and repeated the name, trying to grasp the new and sinister suggestion, which, if Hanaud were right, its sound must henceforth bear. Of course, Hanaud might be wrong. Only, if he were wrong, how had he come to suspect Harry Wethermill? What had first directed his thoughts to that seemingly heartbroken man, and when? Certain recollections became vivid in Mr. Ricardo's mind. The luncheon at the Villa Rose, for instance. Hanaud had been so insistent that the woman with the red hair was to be found in Geneva, had so clearly laid it down that a message, a telegram, a letter from Aix to Geneva, would enable him to lay his hands upon the murderer in Aix. He was isolating the house in Geneva even so early in the history of his investigations. Even so soon he suspected Harry Wethermill. Brains and audacity, yes, these two qualities he had stipulated in the criminal. Ricardo now for the first time understood the trend of all Hanaud's talk at that luncheon. He was putting Harry Wethermill upon his guard. He was immobilizing him. He was fettering him in precautions. With a subtle skill he was forcing him to isolate himself. And he was doing it deliberately to save the life of Celia Harland in Geneva. Once Ricardo lifted himself up with the hair stirring on his scalp. He himself had been with Wethermill in the baccarat rooms on the very night of the murder. They had walked together up the hill to the hotel. It could not be that Harry Wethermill was guilty. And yet he suddenly remembered they had together left the rooms at an early hour. It was only 10 o'clock when they had separated in the hall, when they had gone each to his own room. There would have been time for Wethermill to reach the Villa Rose and do his dreadful work upon that night before 12, if all had been arranged beforehand, if all went as it had been arranged. And as he thought upon the careful planning of that crime, and remembered Wethermill's easy chatter as they had strolled from table to table in the Villa des Fleurs, Ricardo shuddered. Though he encouraged a taste for the bizarre, it was with an effort. He was naturally of an orderly mind, and to touch the eerie or inhuman caused him a physical discomfort. So now he marvelled in a great uneasiness at the calm placidity with which Wethermill had talked, his arm in his, while the load of so dark a crime to be committed within the hour lay upon his mind. Each minute he must have been thinking, with a swift spasm of the heart, should such a precaution fail, should such or such an unforeseen thing intervene? Yet there had never been a sign of disturbance, never a hint of any disquietude. Then Ricardo's thoughts turned, as he tossed upon his bed, to Celia Harland, a tragic and a lonely figure. He recalled the look of tenderness upon her face when her eyes had met Harry Wethermill's across the baccarat table in the Villa des Fleurs. He gained some insight into the reason why she had clung so desperately to Hanaud's coat sleeve yesterday. Not merely had he saved her life. She was lying with all her world of trust and illusion broken about her, and Hanaud had raised her up. She had found someone whom she trusted, the big Newfoundland dog, as she expressed it. Mr. Ricardo was still thinking of Celia Harland when the morning came. He fell asleep and awoke to find Hanaud by his bed. "You will be wanted today," said Hanaud. Ricardo got up and walked down from the hotel with the detective. The front door faces the hillside of Montrevard, and on this side Mr. Ricardo's rooms looked out. The drive from the front door curves around the end of the long building and joins the road, which then winds down towards the town past the garden at the back of the hotel. Down this road the two men walked while the supporting wall of the garden upon their right hand grew higher and higher above their heads. They came to a steep flight of steps, which makes a short cut from the hotel to the road, and at the steps Hanaud stopped. "Do you see?" he said. "On the opposite side there are no houses. There is only a wall. Behind the wall there are climbing gardens, and the ground falls steeply to the turn of the road below. There's a flight of steps leading down which corresponds with the flight of steps from the garden. Very often there's a sergent de ville stationed on the top of the steps, but there was not one there yesterday afternoon at 3. Behind us is the supporting wall of the hotel garden. Well, look about you. We cannot be seen from the hotel. There's not a soul in sight. Yes, there's someone coming up the hill, but we have been standing here quite long enough for you to stab me and get back to your coffee on the veranda of the hotel." Ricardo started back. "Marthe Gobin!" he cried. "It was here, then?" Hanaud nodded. "When we returned from the station in your motor car and went up to your rooms, we passed Harry Wethermill sitting upon the veranda over the garden drinking his coffee. He had the news then that Marthe Gobin was on her way." "But you had isolated the house in Geneva. How could he have the news?" exclaimed Ricardo, whose brain was whirling. "I had isolated the house from him, in the sense that he dared not communicate with his accomplices. That is what you have to remember. He could not even let them know that they must not communicate with him. So he received a telegram. It was carefully worded. No doubt he had arranged the wording of any message with the care which was used in all the preparations. It ran like this," and Hanaud took a scrap of paper from his pocket and read out from it a copy of the telegram. Agent arrives X37 to negotiate purchase of your patent. The telegram was handed in at Geneva Station at 12:45, 5 minutes after the train had left, which carried Marthe Gobin to Aix. And more, it was handed in by a man strongly representing Hippolyte Tasse. That we know. That was madness, said Ricardo. But what else could they do over there in Geneva? They did not know that Harry Wethermill was suspected. Harry Wethermill had no idea of it himself. But even if they had known, they must take the risk. Put yourself into their place for a moment. They had seen my advertisement about Célie Harland in the Geneva paper. Marthe Gobin, that busybody who was always watching her neighbours, was no doubt watched herself. They see her leave the house, an unusual proceeding for her with her husband ill, as her own letter tells us. Hippolyte follows her to the station, sees her take her ticket to Aix, and mounts into the train. He must guess at once that she saw Célie Harland enter their house, that she is travelling to Aix with the information of her whereabouts. At all costs she must be prevented from giving that information. At all risks, therefore, the warning telegram must be sent to Harry Wethermill. Ricardo recognized the force of the argument. "If only you had heard of the telegram yesterday in time!" he cried. "Ah, yes," Hanaud agreed. "But it was only sent off at 1:15. It was delivered to Wethermill, and a copy was sent to the Préfecture, but the telegram was delivered first." "When was it delivered to Wethermill?" asked Ricardo. "At 3. We had already left for the station. Wethermill was standing on the veranda. The telegram was brought to him there. It was brought by a waiter in the hotel who remembers the incident very well. Wethermill has 7 minutes, and the time it will take for Marthe Gobin to drive from the station to the Majestic. What does he do? He runs up first to your rooms, very likely not knowing what he must do. He runs up to verify his telegram." "Are you sure of that?" cried Ricardo. "How can you be? You were at the station with me. What makes you sure?" Hanaud produced a brown kid glove from his pocket. "This." "That is your glove. You told me so yesterday." "I told you so," replied Hanaud calmly, "but it is not my glove. It is Wethermill's. There are his initials stamped upon the lining. See? I picked up that glove in your room after we had returned from the station. It was not there before. He went to your rooms. No doubt he searched for a telegram. Fortunately he did not examine your letters, or Marthe Gobin would never have spoken to us as she did after she was dead." "Then what did he do?" asked Ricardo eagerly. And though Hanaud had been with him at the entrance to the station all this while, he asked the question in absolute confidence that the true answer would be given to him. "He returned to the veranda, wondering what he should do. He saw us come back from the station in the motor car and go up to your room. We were alone. Marthe Gobin, then, was following. There was his chance. Marthe Gobin must not reach us, must not tell her news to us. He ran down the garden steps to the gate. No one could see him from the hotel. Very likely he hid behind the trees whence he could watch the road. A cab comes up the hill. There's a woman in it. Not quite the kind of woman who stays at your hotel, Monsieur Ricardo. Yet she must be going to your hotel, for the road ends. The driver is nodding on his box, refusing to pay any heed to his fare, lest again she should bid him hurry. His horse is moving at a walk. Wethermill puts his head in at the window and asks if she has come to see Monsieur Ricardo. Anxious for her 4,000 francs, she answers yes. Perhaps he steps into the cab. Perhaps as he walks by the side he strikes, and strikes hard and strikes surely. Long before the cab reaches the hotel, he is back again on the veranda." "Yes," said Ricardo. "It's the daring of which you spoke which made the crime possible, the same daring which made him seek your help." "That was unexampled." "No," replied Hanaud. "There's an historic crime in your own country, monsieur. Cries for help were heard in a by-street of a town. When people ran to answer them, a man was found kneeling by a corpse. It was the kneeling man who cried for help, but it was also the kneeling man who did the murder. I remembered that when I first began to suspect Harry Wethermill." Ricardo turned eagerly. And when? When did you first begin to suspect Harry Wethermill?" Hanaud smiled and shook his head. "That you shall know in good time. I am the captain of the ship." His voice took on a deeper note. "But I prepare you. Listen. Daring and brains, those were the property of Harry Wethermill, yes. But it is not he who is the chief actor in the crime. Of that I am sure. He was no more than one of the instruments." "One of the instruments? Used, then, by whom?" asked Ricardo. "By my Normandy peasant woman, Monsieur Ricardo," said Hanaud. "Yes, there's the dominating figure, cruel, masterful, relentless, that strange woman, Helene Vauquier. You are surprised? You will see. It is not the man of intellect and daring. It's my peasant woman who is at the bottom of it all." "But she's free!" exclaimed Ricardo. "You let her go free." "Free," repeated Ricardo. "She was driven straight from the Villa Rose to the dépôt. She has been kept au secret ever since." Ricardo stared in amazement. "Already you knew of her guilt?" "Already she had lied to me in her description of Adèle Rossignol. Do you remember what she said? A black-haired woman with beady eyes, an eye only 5 minutes before had picked up from the table this." He opened his pocket-book and took from an envelope a long strand of red hair. "But it was not only because she lied that I had her taken to the dépôt. A pot of cold cream had disappeared from the room of Mademoiselle Celie." "Then Perrichet, after all, was right." "Perrichet, after all, was quite wrong not to hold his tongue, for in that pot of cold cream, as I was sure, were hidden those valuable diamond earrings which Mademoiselle Celie habitually wore." The two men had reached the square in front of the Établissement des Bains. Ricardo dropped onto a bench and wiped his forehead. "But I am in a maze," he cried. "My head turns round. I don't know where I am." Hanaud stood in front of Ricardo, smiling. He was not displeased with his companion's bewilderment. It was also much of tribute to himself. "I am the captain of the ship," he said. His smile irritated Ricardo, who spoke impatiently. "I should be very glad," he said, "if you would tell me how you discovered all these things, and what it was that the little salon on the first morning had to tell to you, and why Celia Harland ran from the glass doors across the grass to the motor car, and again from the carriage into the house on the lake. Why did she not resist yesterday evening? Why did she not cry for help? How much of Helene Vauquier's evidence was true and how much false? For what reason Wethermill concerned himself in this affair? Oh, and 1,000 things which I don't understand." "Ah, the cushions and the scrap of paper and the aluminium flask," said Hanaud, and the triumph faded from his face. He spoke now to Ricardo with a genuine friendliness. "You must not be angry with me if I keep you in the dark for a little while. I, too, Mr. Ricardo, have artistic inclinations. I will not spoil the remarkable story which I think Mademoiselle Celie will be ready to tell us. Afterwards I will willingly explain to you what I read in the evidences of the room, and what so greatly puzzled me then. But it is not the puzzle or its solution," he said modestly, "which is most interesting here. Consider the people. Madame Dauvray, the old, rich, ignorant woman, with her superstitions and her generosity, her desire to converse with Madame de Montespan and the great ladies of the past, and her love of a young, fresh face about her. Helene Vauquier, the maid with her 6 years of confidential service, who finds herself suddenly supplanted and made to tend and dress in dainty frocks the girl who has supplanted her. The young girl herself, that poor child, with her love of fine clothes, the bohemian who, brought up amidst trickeries and practising them as a profession, looking upon them and upon misery and starvation and despair as the commonplaces of life, keeps a simplicity and a delicacy and a freshness which would have withered in a day had she been brought up otherwise. Harry Wethermill, the courted and successful man of genius. Just imagine, if you can, what his feelings must have been when in Madame Dauvray's bedroom, with the woman he had uselessly murdered lying rigid beneath the sheet, he saw me raise the block of wood from the inlaid floor and take out one by one those jewel cases for which less than 12 hours before he had been ransacking that very room. But what he must have felt! And to give no sign! Oh, these people are the interesting problems in the story. Let us hear what happened on that terrible night. The puzzle, that can wait." In Mr. Ricardo's view, Hanaud was proved right. The extraordinary and appalling story, which was gradually unrolled, of what had happened on that night of Tuesday in the Villa Rose, exceeded in its grim interest all the mystery of the puzzle. But it was not told at once. The trouble at first with Mademoiselle Celie was a fear of sleep. She dared not sleep, even with a light in the room and a nurse at her bedside. When her eyes were actually closing, she would force herself desperately back into the living world. For when she slept, she dreamed through again that dark and dreadful night of Tuesday, and the 2 days which followed it, until at some moment endurance snapped and she woke up screaming. But youth, a good constitution, and a healthy appetite had their way with her in the end. She told her share of the story. She told what happened. There was apparently one terrible scene when she was confronted with Harry Wethermill in the office of Monsieur Fleuriot, the juge d'instruction, and on her knees, with the tears streaming down her face, besought him to confess the truth. For a long while he held out. And then there came a strange and human turn to the affair. Adèle Rossignol, or to give her real name, Adèle Tasse, the wife of Hippolyte, had conceived a veritable passion for Harry Wethermill. He was of a not uncommon type, cold and callous in himself, yet with the power to provoke passion in women. And Adèle Tasse, as the story was told of how Harry Wethermill had paid his court to Celia Harland, was seized with a vindictive jealousy. Hanaud was not surprised. He knew the woman criminal of his country, brutal, passionate, treacherous. The anonymous letters in a woman's handwriting which descend upon the Rue de Jérusalem and betray the men who have committed thefts had left him no illusions upon that figure in the history of crime. Adèle Rossignol ran forward to confess, so that Harry Wethermill might suffer to the last possible point of suffering. Then, at last, Wethermill gave in, and, broken down by the ceaseless interrogations of the magistrate, confessed in his turn too. The one and the only one who stood firmly throughout and denied the crime was Hélène Vauquier. Her thin lips were kept contemptuously closed, whatever the others might admit. With a white, hard face, quietly and respectfully, she faced the magistrate week after week. She was the perfect picture of a servant who knew her place, and nothing was wrung from her. But without her help, the story became complete, and Ricardo was at pains to write it out. End of chapter 14. Of At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Celia's Story. The story begins with the explanation of that circumstance which had greatly puzzled Mr. Ricardo, Celia's entry into the household of Madame Dauvray. Celia's father was a Captain Harland of a marching regiment, who had little beyond good looks and excellent manners wherewith to support his position. He was extravagant in his tastes and of an easy mind in the presence of embarrassments. To his other disadvantages he added that of falling in love with a pretty girl no better off than himself. They married, and Celia was born. For 9 years they managed, through the wife's constant devotion, to struggle along and to give their daughter an education. Then, however, Celia's mother broke down under the strain and died. Captain Harland, a couple of years later, went out of the service with discredit, passed through the bankruptcy court, and turned showman. His line was thought-reading. He enlisted the services of his daughter, taught her the tricks of his trade, and became the great Fortinbras of the music halls. Captain Harland would move amongst the audience, asking the spectators in a whisper to think of a number or of an article in their pockets after the usual fashion, while the child, in her short frock and with her long fair hair tied back with a ribbon, would stand blindfolded upon the platform and reel off the answers with astonishing rapidity. She was singularly quick, singularly receptive. The undoubted cleverness of the performance and the beauty of the child brought to them a temporary prosperity. The great Fortinbras rose from the music halls to the assembly rooms of provincial towns. The performance became genteel, and ladies flocked to the matinees. The great Fortinbras dropped his pseudonym and became once more Captain Harland. As Celia grew up, he tried a yet higher flight. He became a spiritualist, with Celia for his medium. The thought-reading entertainments became thrilling seances, and the beautiful child, now grown into a beautiful girl of 17, created a greater sensation as a medium in a trance than she had done as a lightning thought-reader. I saw no harm in it, Celia explained to M. Fleuriot, without any attempt at extenuation. I never understood that we might be doing any hurt to anyone. People were interested. They were to find us out if they could, and they tried to and they couldn't. I looked upon it quite simply in that way. It was just my profession. I accepted it without any question. I was not troubled about it until I came to Aix. A startling exposure, however, at Cambridge discredited the craze for spiritualism, and Captain Harland's fortunes declined. He crossed with his daughter to France and made a disastrous tour in that country, wasted the last of his resources in the casino at Dieppe, and died in that town, leaving Celia just enough money to bury him and to pay her third-class fare to Paris. There she lived honestly but miserably. The slimness of her figure and a grace of movement which was particularly hers obtained her at last a situation as a mannequin in the showrooms of a modiste. She took a room on the top floor of a house in the Rue Saint-Honoré and settled down to a hard and penurious life. I was not happy or contented, no, said Celia frankly and decisively. The long hours in the close rooms gave me headaches and made me nervous. I had not the temperament. And I was very lonely. My life had been so different. I had had fresh air, good clothes, and freedom. Now all was changed. I used to cry myself to sleep up in my little room, wondering whether I would ever have friends. You see, I was quite young, only 18, and I wanted to live. A change came in a few months, but a disastrous change. The modiste failed. Celia was thrown out of work and could get nothing to do. Gradually she pawned what clothes she could spare, and then there came a morning when she had a single 5-franc piece in the world and owed a month's rent for her room. She kept the 5-franc piece all day and went hungry, seeking for work. In the evening she went to a provision shop to buy food, and the man behind the counter took the 5-franc piece. He looked at it, rung it on the counter, and with a laugh bent it easily in half. "See here, my little one," he said, tossing the coin back to her. "One does not buy good food with lead." Celia dragged herself out of the shop in despair. She was starving. She dared not go back to her room. The thought of the concierge at the bottom of the stairs, insistent for the rent, frightened her. She stood on the pavement and burst into tears. A few people stopped and watched her curiously, and went on again. Finally, a sergent de ville told her to go away. The girl moved on with the tears running down her cheeks. She was desperate. She was lonely. "I thought of throwing myself into the Seine," said Celia simply, in telling her story to the juge d'instruction. "Indeed, I went to the river. But the water looked so cold, so terrible. And I was young. I wanted so much to live. And then the night came, and the lights made the city bright, and I was very tired, and in a word, the young girl went up to Montmartre in desperation as quickly as her tired legs would carry her. She walked once or twice timidly past the restaurants, and finally entered one of them, hoping that someone would take pity on her and give her some supper. She stood just within the door of the supper room. People pushed past her, men in evening dress, women in bright frocks and jewels. No one noticed her. She had shrunk into a corner, rather hoping not to be noticed, now that she had come. But the novelty of her surroundings wore off. She knew that for want of food she was almost fainting. There were 2 girls engaged by the management to dance amongst the tables while people had supper, one dressed as a page in blue satin, the other as a Spanish dancer. Both girls were kind. They spoke to Celia between their dances. They let her waltz with them. Still, no one noticed her. She had no jewels, no fine clothes, no chic, the three indispensable things. She had only youth and a pretty face. "But," said Celia, "without jewels and fine clothes and chic, these go for nothing in Paris." At last, however, Madame Dauvray came in with a party of friends from a theatre, and saw how unhappy I was, and gave me some supper. She asked me about myself, and I told her. She was very kind, and took me home with her, and I cried all the way in the carriage. She kept me a few days, and then she told me that I was to live with her, for often she was lonely too, and that if I would, she would some day find me a nice comfortable husband and give me a marriage portion. So all my troubles seemed to be at an end, said Celia with a smile. Within a fortnight, Madame Dauvray confided to Celia that there was a new fortune-teller come to Paris, who by looking into a crystal could tell the most wonderful things about the future. The old woman's eyes kindled as she spoke. She took Celia to the fortune-teller's rooms the next day, and the girl quickly understood the ruling passion of the woman who had befriended her. It took very little time then for Celia to notice how easily Madame Dauvray was duped, how perpetually she was robbed. Celia turned the problem over in her mind. "Madame had been very good to me. She was kind and simple," said Celia with a very genuine affection in her voice. "The people whom we knew laughed at her and were ungenerous. But there are many women whom the world respects who are worse than ever was poor Madame Dauvray. I was very fond of her, so I proposed to her that we should hold a séance, and I would bring people from the spirit world I knew, that I could amuse her with something much more clever and more interesting than the fortune-tellers. And at the same time I could save her from being plundered. That was all I thought about." That was all she thought about, yes. She left Helene Vauquier out of her calculations, and she did not foresee the effect of her stances upon Madame Dauvray. Celia had no suspicions of Helene Vauquier. She would have laughed if anyone had told her that this respectable and respectful middle-aged woman, who was so attentive, so neat, so grateful for any kindness, was really nursing a rancorous hatred against her. Celia had sprung from Montmartre suddenly, therefore Helene Vauquier despised her. Celia had taken her place in Madame Dauvray's confidence, had deposed her unwittingly, had turned the confidential friend into a mere servant. Therefore Helene Vauquier hated her, and her hatred reached out beyond the girl and embraced the old, superstitious, foolish woman whom a young and pretty face could so easily beguile. Helene Vauquier despised them both, hated them both, and yet must nurse her rancour in silence and futility. Then came the séances, and at once, to add fuel to her hatred, she found herself stripped of those gifts and commissions which she had exacted from the herd of common tricksters who had been wont to make their harvest out of Madame Dauvray. Helene Vauquier was avaricious and greedy, like so many of her class. Her hatred of Celia, her contempt for Madame Dauvray, grew into a very delirium. But it was a delirium she had the cunning to conceal. She lived at white heat, but to all the world she had lost nothing of her calm. Celia did not foresee the hatred she was arousing, nor, on the other hand, did she foresee the overwhelming effect of these spiritualistic séances on Madame Dauvray. Celia had never been brought quite close to the credulous before. There had always been the row of footlights, she said. I was on the platform, the audience was in the hall, or, if it was at a house, my father made the arrangements. I only came in at the last moment, played my part, and went away. It was never brought home to me that some amongst these people really and truly believed. I did not think about it. Now, however, when I saw Madame Dauvray so feverish, so excited, so firmly convinced that great ladies from the spirit world came and spoke to her, I became terrified. I had aroused a passion which I had not suspected. I tried to stop the séances, but I was not allowed. I had aroused a passion which I could not control. I was afraid that Madame Dauvray's whole life— it seems absurd to those who did not know her, but those who did will understand. Yes, her whole life and happiness would be spoiled if she discovered that what she believed in was all a trick. She spoke with a simplicity and a remorse which it was difficult to disbelieve. Monsieur Fleuriot, the judge, now at last convinced that the Dreyfus affair was for nothing in the history of this crime, listened to her with sympathy. "That is your explanation, mademoiselle," he said gently, "but I must tell you that we have another." "Yes, monsieur?" Celia asked. "Given by Helene Vauquier," said Fleuriot. Even after these days Celia could not hear that woman's name without a shudder of fear and a flinching of her whole body. Her face grew white, her lips dry. "I know, monsieur, that Helene Vauquier is not my friend," she said. "I was taught that very cruelly." "Listen, mademoiselle, to what she says," said the judge, and he read out to Celia an extract or two from Hanaud's report of his first interview with Helene Vauquier in her bedroom at the Villa Rose. "You hear what she says. Madame Dauvray would have had séances all day, but Mademoiselle Celie pleaded that she was left exhausted at the end of them. But Mademoiselle Celie was of an address." And again, speaking of Madame Dauvray's queer craze that the spirit of Madame de Montespan should be called up, Helene Vauquier says, "She was never gratified. Always she hoped. Always Mademoiselle Celie tantalized her with the hope. She would not spoil her fine affairs by making these treats too common. Thus she attributes your reluctance to multiply your experiments to a desire to make the most profit possible out of your wares, like a good business woman." "It is not true, monsieur," cried Celia earnestly. "I tried to stop the séances because now for the first time I recognized that I had been playing with a dangerous thing. It was a revelation to me. I did not know what to do. Madame Dauvray would promise me everything, give me everything, if only I would consent when I refused. I was terribly frightened of what would happen. I did not want power over people. I knew it was not good for her that she should suffer so much excitement. No, I did not know what to do. And so we all moved to Aix. And there she met Harry Wethermill on the second day after her arrival, and proceeded straightway for the first time to fall in love. To Celia it seemed that at last that had happened for which she had so longed. She began really to live as she understood life at this time. The day, until she met Harry Wethermill, was one flash of joyous expectation. The hours when they were together, a time of contentment, which thrilled with some chance meeting of the hands into an exquisite happiness. Madame Dauvray understood quickly what was the matter, and laughed at her affectionately. "Celie, my dear," she said, "your friend, Monsieur Wethermill, Harry, is it not? See, I pronounce your tongue. Will not be as comfortable as the nice, fat, bourgeois gentleman I meant to find for you. But since you are young, naturally you want storms. And there will be storms, Celie," she concluded with a laugh. Celia blushed. "I suppose there will," she said regretfully. There were indeed moments when she was frightened of Harry Wethermill, but frightened with the delicious thrill of knowledge that he was only stern because he cared so much. But in a day or two there began to intrude upon her happiness a stinging disaffection with her past life. At times she fell into melancholy, comparing her career with that of the man who loved her. At times she came near to an extreme irritation with Helene Vauquier. Her lover was in her thoughts. As she put it herself, "I wanted always to look my best, and always to be very good." Good in the essentials of life, that is to be understood. She had lived in a lax world. She was not particularly troubled by the character of her associates. She was untouched by them. She liked her fling at the baccarat tables. These were details and did not distress her. Love had not turned her into a Puritan. But certain recollections plagued her soul. The visit to the restaurant at Montmartre, for instance, and the séances. Of these, indeed, she thought to have made an end. There were the baccarat rooms and the beauty of the town and the neighbourhood to distract Madame Dauvray. Celia kept her thoughts away from séances. There was no séance as yet held in the Villa Rose, and there would have been none but for Helene Vauquier. One evening, however, as Harry Wethermill walked down from the Cercle to the Villa des Fleurs, A woman's voice spoke to him from behind. "Monsieur." He turned and saw Madame Dauvray's maid. He stopped under a street lamp and said, "Well, what can I do for you?" The woman hesitated. "I hope monsieur will pardon me," she said humbly. "I am committing a great impertinence. But I think monsieur is not very kind to Mademoiselle Celie." Wethermill stared at her. "What on earth do you mean?" he asked angrily. Helene Vauquier looked him quietly in the face. "It is plain, monsieur, that Mademoiselle Celie loves monsieur. Monsieur has led her on to love him. But it is also plain to a woman with quick eyes that monsieur himself cares no more for mademoiselle than for the button on his coat. It is not very kind to spoil the happiness of a young and pretty girl, monsieur." Nothing could have been more respectful than the manner in which these words were uttered. Wethermill was taken in by it. He protested earnestly, fearing lest the maid should become an enemy. "Helene, it is not true that I am playing with Mademoiselle Celie. Why should I not care for her?" Helene Vauquier shrugged her shoulders. The question needed no answer. "Why should I seek her so often if I did not care?" And to this question Helene Vauquier smiled, a quiet, slow, confidential smile. "What does monsieur want of Madame Dauvray?" she asked, and the question was her answer. Wethermill stood silent. Then he said abruptly, "Nothing, of course, nothing." And he walked away. But the smile remained on Helene Vauquier's face. What did they all want of Madame Dauvray? She knew very well. It was what she herself wanted, with other things. It was money, always money. Wethermill was not the first to seek the good graces of Madame Dauvray through her pretty companion. Helene Vauquier went home. She was not discontented with her conversation. Wethermill had paused long enough before he denied the suggestion of her words. She approached him a few days later a second time, and more openly. She was shopping in the Rue de Cassino when he passed her. He stopped of his own accord and spoke to her. Helene Vauquier kept a grave and respectful face, but there was a pulse of joy at her heart. He was coming to her hand. "Monsieur," she said, "you do not go the right way." And again her strange smile illuminated her face. "Mademoiselle Celie sets a guard about Madame Dauvray. She will not give to people the opportunity to find Madame generous." "Oh," said Wethermill slowly, "is that so?" And he turned and walked by Helene Vauquier's side. "Never speak of Madame Dauvray's wealth, monsieur, if you would keep the favour of Mademoiselle Celie. She is young, but she knows her world." "I have not spoken of money to her," replied Wethermill. And then he burst out laughing. "But why should you think that I of all men, want money?" he asked. And Helene answered him again enigmatically. "If I am wrong, monsieur, I am sorry, but you can help me too," she said, in her submissive voice. And she passed on, leaving Wethermill rooted to the ground. It was a bargain she proposed. The impertinence of it! It was a bargain she proposed. The value of it! In that shape ran Harry Wethermill's thoughts. He was in desperate straits, though to the world's eye he was a man of wealth. A gambler, with no inexpensive tastes, he had always been in need of money. The rights in his patent he had mortgaged long ago. He was not an idler. He was no sham foisted as a great man on an ignorant public. He had really some touch of genius, and he cultivated it assiduously. But the harder he worked, the greater was his need of gaiety and extravagance. Gifted with good looks and a charm of manner, he was popular alike in the great world and the world of Bohemia. He kept and wanted to keep a foot in each. That he was in desperate straits now, probably Helene Vauquier alone in Aix had recognized. She had drawn her inference from one simple fact. Wethermill asked her at a later time, when they were better acquainted, how she had guessed his need. "Monsieur," she replied, "you were in Aix without a valet, and it seemed to me that you were of that class of men who would never move without a valet so long as there was money to pay his wages. That was my first thought. Then, when I saw you pursue your friendship with Mademoiselle Celie, you, who so clearly to my eyes did not love her, I felt sure." On the next occasion that the two met, it was again Harry Wethermill who sought Helene Vauquier. He talked for a minute or two upon indifferent subjects, and then he said quickly, "I suppose Madame Dauvray is very rich?" "She has a great fortune in jewels," said Helene Vauquier. Wethermill started. He was agitated that evening, the woman saw. His hand shook, his face twitched. Clearly he was hard put to it, for he seldom betrayed himself. She thought it time to strike. "Jewels which she keeps in the safe in her bedroom," she added. "Then why don't you—" he began, and stopped. "I said that I too needed help," replied Helene, without a ruffle of her composure. It was 9 o'clock at night. Helene Vauquier had come down to the Casino with a wrap for Madame Dauvray. The two people were walking down the little street of which the Casino blocks the end, and it happened that an attendant at the Casino, named Alphonse Ruel, passed them, recognized them both, and smiled to himself with some amusement. What was Wethermill doing in company with Madame Dauvray's maid? Ruel had no doubt. Ruel had seen Wethermill often enough in these recent days with Madame Dauvray's pretty companion. Ruel had all a Frenchman's sympathy with lovers. He wished them well, those two young and attractive people, and hoped that the maid would help their plans. But as he passed, he caught a sentence spoken suddenly by Wethermill. "Well, it is true, I must have money." And the agitated voice and the words remained fixed in his memory. He heard, too, a warning, "Hush," from the maid. Then they passed out of his hearing. But he turned and saw that Wethermill was talking volubly. What Harry Wethermill was saying, he was saying in a foolish burst of confidence. "You have guessed it, Helene, you alone." He had mortgaged his patent twice over, once in France, once in England, and the second time had been a month ago. He had received a large sum down, which went to pay his pressing creditors. He had hoped to pay the sum back from a new invention. "But, Helene, I tell you," he said, "I have a conscience." And when she smiled, he explained, "Oh, not what the priests would call a conscience, that I know. But none the less I have a conscience about the things which really matter, at all events to me. There is a flaw in that new invention. It can be improved, I know that. But as yet I do not see how, and I cannot help it. I must get it right. I cannot let it go imperfect when I know that it's imperfect, when I know that it can be improved, when I am sure that I shall sooner or later hit upon the needed improvement. That's what I mean when I say I have a conscience." Helene Vauquier smiled indulgently. Men were queer fish. Things which were really of no account troubled and perplexed them, and gave them sleepless nights. But it was not for her to object, since it was one of these queer anomalies which was giving her her chance. "And the people are finding out that you have sold your rights twice over," she said, sympathetically. "That is a pity, monsieur." "They know," he answered. "Those in England know." "And they are very angry?" "They threaten me," said Wethermill. "They give me a month to restore the money. Otherwise there will be disgrace, imprisonment, penal servitude." Helene Vauquier walked calmly on. No sign of the intense joy which she felt was visible in her face, and only a trace of it in her voice. "Monsieur will, perhaps, meet me tomorrow in Geneva," she said, and she named a small café in a back street. "I can get a holiday for the afternoon." And as they were near to the villa and the lights, she walked on ahead. Wethermill loitered behind. He had tried his luck at the tables and had failed. And he must have the money. He travelled accordingly the next day to Geneva, and was there presented to Adèle Tasse and Hippolyte. "They are trusted friends of mine," said Helene Vauquier to Wethermill, who was not inspired to confidence by the sight of the young man with the big ears and the plastered hair. As a matter of fact, she had never met them before they came this year to Aix. The Tasse family, which consisted of Adèle and her husband and Jeanne, her mother, were practised criminals. They had taken the house in Geneva deliberately in order to carry out some robberies from the great villas on the lakeside. But they had not been fortunate, and a description of Madame Dauvray's jewellery in the woman's column of a Geneva newspaper had drawn Adèle Tace over to Aix. She had set about the task of seducing Madame Dauvray's maid, and found a master, not an instrument. In the small café on that afternoon of July, Hélène Vauquier instructed her accomplices, quietly and methodically, as though what she proposed was the most ordinary stroke of business. Once or twice subsequently Wethermill, who was the only safe go-between, went to the house in Geneva, altering his hair and wearing a moustache to complete the arrangements. He maintained firmly at his trial that at none of these meetings was there any talk of murder. "To be sure," said the judge with a savage sarcasm, "in decent conversation there is always a reticence. Something is left to be understood." And it is difficult to understand how murder could not have been an essential part of their plan since... But let us see what happened. End of chapter 15. At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. The First Move. On the Friday before the crime was committed, Madame Dauvray and Celia dined at the Villa des Fleurs. While they were drinking their coffee, Harry Wethermill joined them. He stayed with them until Madame Dauvray was ready to move, and then all three walked into the baccarat rooms together. But there, in the throng of people, they were separated. Harry Wethermill was looking carefully after Celia, as a good lover should. He had, it seemed, no eyes for anyone else, and it was not until a minute or two had passed that the girl herself noticed that Madame Dauvray was not with them. "We will find her easily," said Harry. "Of course," replied Celia. "There is, after all, no hurry," said Wethermill with a laugh, "and perhaps she was not unwilling to leave us together." Celia dimpled to a smile. "Madame Dauvray is kind to me," she said, with a very pretty timidity. "And yet more kind to me," said Wethermill, in a low voice which brought the blood into Celia's cheeks. But even while he spoke he soon caught sight of Madame Dauvray standing by one of the tables, and near to her was Adèle Tace. Adèle had not yet made Madame Dauvray's acquaintance, that was evident. She was apparently unaware of her, but she was gradually edging towards her. Wethermill smiled, and Celia caught the smile. "What is it?" she asked, and her head began to turn in the direction of Madame Dauvray. "Why, I like your frock, that's all," said Wethermill at once, and Celia's eyes went down to it. "Do you?" she said with a pleased smile. It was a dress of dark blue which suited her well. "I am glad. I think it is pretty." And they passed on. Wethermill stayed by the girl's side throughout the evening. Once again he saw Madame Dauvray and Adèle Tace. But now they were together, now they were talking. The first step had been taken. Adèle Tace had scraped acquaintance with Madame Dauvray. Celia saw them almost at the same moment. "Oh, there is Madame Dauvray," she cried, taking a step towards her. Wethermill detained the girl. "She seems quite happy," he said. And indeed Madame Dauvray was talking volubly and with the utmost interest, the jewels sparkling about her neck. She raised her head, saw Celia, nodded to her affectionately, and then pointed her out to her companion. Adèle Tace looked the girl over with interest and smiled contentedly. There was nothing to be feared from her. Her youth, her very daintiness, seemed to offer her as the easiest of victims. "You see, Madame Dauvray does not want you," said Harry Wethermill. "Let us go and play chemin de fer," and they did, moving off into one of the further rooms. It was not until another hour had passed that Celia rose and went in search of Madame Dauvray. She found her still talking earnestly to Adèle Tace. Madame Dauvray got up at once. "Are you ready to go, dear?" she asked, and she turned to Adèle Tace. "This is Célie, Madame Rossignol," she said, and she spoke with a marked significance and a note of actual exultation in her voice. Celia, however, was not unused to this tone. Madame Dauvray was proud of her companion, and had a habit of showing her off to the girl's discomfort. The three women spoke a few words, and then Madame Dauvray and Celia left the rooms and walked to the entrance doors. But as they walked, Celia became alarmed. She was by nature extraordinarily sensitive to impressions. It was to that quick receptivity that the success of the great Fortinbras had been chiefly due. She had a gift of rapid comprehension. It was not that she argued or deducted or inferred, but she felt. To take a metaphor from the work of the man she loved, she was a natural receiver. So now, although no word was spoken, she was aware that Madame Dauvray was greatly excited, greatly disturbed, and she dreaded the reason of that excitement and disturbance. While they were driving home in the motor car, she said apprehensively, "You met a friend, then, tonight, madame?" "No," said Madame Dauvray. "I made a friend. I had not met Madame Rossignol before. A bracelet of hers came undone, and I helped her to fasten it. We talked afterwards. She lives in Geneva." Madame Dauvray was silent for a moment or two. Then she turned impulsively and spoke in a voice of appeal. "Celie, we talked of things," and the girl moved impatiently. She understood very well what were the things of which Madame Dauvray and her new friend had talked. And she laughed. I could not bear it. Celia was silent, and Madame Dauvray went on in a voice of awe. "I told her of the wonderful things which happened when I sat with Hélène in the dark. How the room filled with strange sounds, how ghostly fingers touched my forehead and my eyes. She laughed. Adèle Rossignol laughed, Celie. I told her of the spirits with whom we held converse. She would not believe. Do you remember the evening, Celie, when Madame de Castiglione came back, an old, old woman, and told us how, when she had grown old and had lost her beauty and was very lonely, she would no longer live in the great house which was so full of torturing memories, but took a small apartment near by, where no one knew her, and how she used to walk out late at night and watch, with her eyes full of tears, the dark windows which had been once so bright with light? Adèle Rossignol would not believe. I told her that I had found the story afterwards in a volume of memoirs. Adèle Rossignol laughed and said, 'No doubt you had read that volume yourself before the séance.'" Celia stirred guiltily. "She had no faith in you, Celie. It made me angry, dear. She said that you invented your own tests. She sneered at them. A string across a cupboard. A child, she said, could manage that, much more than a clever young lady. Oh, she admitted that you were clever. Indeed, she urged that you were far too clever to submit to the tests of someone you did not know. I replied that you would. I was right, Celie, was I not?" And again the appeal sounded rather piteously in Madame Dauvray's voice. "Tests," said Celia, with a contemptuous laugh. And in truth she was not afraid of them. Madame Dauvray's voice at once took courage. "There!" she cried triumphantly. "I was sure. I told her so. Celie, I arranged with her that next Tuesday—" And Celia interrupted quickly. "No, oh no!" Again there was silence, and then Madame Dauvray said gently, but very seriously, "Celie, you are not kind." Celia was moved by the reproach. "Oh, madame," she cried eagerly, "please don't think that. How could I be anything else to you, who is so kind to me?" "Then prove it, Celie. On Tuesday I have asked Madame Rossignol to come, and—" The old woman's voice became tremulous with excitement. "And perhaps, who knows, perhaps she will appear to us." Celia had no doubt who she was. She was Madame de Montespan. "Oh, no, madame," she stammered. "Here at Aix we are not in the spirit for such things." And then, in a voice of dread, Madame Dauvray asked, "Is it true, then, what Adèle said?" And Celia started violently. Madame Dauvray doubted. "I believe it would break my heart, my dear, if I were to think that, if I were to know that you had tricked me," she said, with a trembling voice. Celia covered her face with her hands. It would be true. She had no doubt of it. Madame Dauvray would never forgive herself, would never forgive Celia. Her infatuation had grown so to engross her that the rest of her life would surely be embittered. It was not merely a passion, it was a creed as well. Celia shrank from the renewal of these seances. Every fibre in her was in revolt. They were so unworthy of Harry Wethermill and of herself as she now herself wished to be. But she had to pay now. The moment for payment had come. "Celie," said Madame Dauvray, "it isn't true. Surely it isn't true." Celia drew her hands away from her face. "Let Madame Rossignol come on Tuesday," she cried, and the old woman caught the girl's hand and pressed it with affection. "Oh, thank you, she cried. "Adèle Rossignol laughs tonight. We shall convince her on Tuesday, Celie. Celie, I am so glad." And her voice sank into a solemn whisper, pathetically ludicrous. It is not right that she should laugh. To bring people back through the gates of the spirit world, that is wonderful. To Celia, the sound of the jargon learnt from her own lips, used by herself so thoughtlessly in past times, was odious. For the last time, she pleaded to herself. All her life was going to change. Though no word had yet been spoken by Harry Wethermill, she was sure of it. Just for this one last time, then, so that she might leave Madame Dauvray the colours of her belief, she would hold a séance at the Villa Rose. Madame Dauvray told the news to Helene Vauquier when they reached the villa. "You will be present, Helene," she cried excitedly. "It will be Tuesday. There will be the three of us." "Certainly, if Madame wishes," said Helene submissively. She looked round the room. "Mademoiselle Celie can be placed on a chair in that recess, and the curtains drawn, whilst we, Madame and Madame's friend and I, can sit round this table under the side windows." "Yes," said Celia, "that will do very well." It was Madame Dauvray's habit, when she was particularly pleased with Celia, to dismiss her maid quickly and to send her to brush the girl's hair at night. And in a little while on this night Helene went to Celia's room. While she brushed Celia's hair, she told her that Servettaz's parents lived at Chambéry and that he would like to see them. "But the poor man is afraid to ask for a day," she said. "He has been so short a time with Madame." "Of course Madame will give him a holiday if he asks," replied Celia with a smile. "I will speak to her myself to-morrow." "It would be kind of Mademoiselle," said Helene Vauquier. "But perhaps—" She stopped. "Well?" said Celia. "Perhaps Mademoiselle would do better still to speak to Servettaz himself and encourage him to ask with his own lips. Madame has her moods, is it not so? She does not always like it to be forgotten that she is the mistress." On the next day, accordingly, Celia did speak to Servettaz, and Servettaz asked for his holiday. "But of course," Madame Dauvray at once replied, "we must decide upon a day." It was then that Helene Vauquier ventured humbly upon a suggestion. "Since Madame has a friend coming here on Tuesday, perhaps that would be the best day for him to go. Madame would not be likely to take a long drive that afternoon." "No, indeed," replied Madame Dauvray. "We shall all three dine together early in Aix and return here." "Then I will tell him he may go to-morrow," said Celia. For this conversation took place on the Monday, and in the evening Madame Dauvray and Celia went as usual to the Villa des Fleurs and dined there. "I was in a bad mind," said Celia, when asked by the juge d'instruction to explain that attack of nerves in the garden which Ricardo had witnessed. "I hated more and more the thought of that séance which was to take place on the morrow. I felt that I was disloyal to Harry. My nerves were all tingling. I was not nice that night at all," she added quaintly. "But at dinner I determined that if I met Harry after dinner, as I was sure to do, I would tell him the whole truth about myself. However, when I did meet him, I was frightened. I knew how stern he could suddenly look. I dreaded what he would think. I was too afraid that I should lose him. No, I could not speak. I had not the courage. That made me still more angry with myself, and so I quarrelled at once with Harry. He was surprised, but it was natural, wasn't it? What else should one do under such circumstances except quarrel with the man one loved? Yes, I really quarrelled with him, and said things which I thought and hoped would hurt. Then I ran away from him, lest I should break down and cry. I went to the tables and lost at once all the money I had except one note of 5 louis. But that did not console me, and I ran out into the garden, very unhappy. There I behaved like a child, and Mr. Ricardo saw me. But it was not the little money I had lost which troubled me. No, it was the thought of what a coward I was. Afterwards Harry and I made it up, and I thought, like the little fool I was, that he wanted to ask me to marry him. But I would not let him that night. Oh, I wanted him to ask me. I was longing for him to ask me, but not that night. Somehow I felt that the séance and the tricks must be all over and done with before I could listen or answer. The quiet and simple confession touched the magistrate who listened to it with profound pity. He shaded his eyes with his hand. The girl's sense of her unworthiness, the love she had given so unstintingly to Harry Wethermill, the deep pride she had felt in the delusion that he loved her too, had in it an irony too bitter. But he was aroused to anger against the man. "Go on, mademoiselle," he said, but in spite of himself his voice trembled. "So I arranged with him that we should meet on Wednesday, as Mr. Ricardo heard." "You told him that you would want him on Wednesday," said the judge, quoting Mr. Ricardo's words. "Yes," replied Celia. "I meant that the last word of all these deceptions would have been spoken. I should be free to hear what he had to say to me. You see, monsieur, I was so sure that I knew what it was he had to say to me," and her voice broke upon the words. She recovered herself with an effort. "Then I went home with Madame Dauvray." On the morning of Tuesday, however, there came a letter from Adèle Tasse, of which no trace was afterwards discovered. The letter invited Madame Dauvray and Celia to come out to Annecy and dine with her at a hotel there. They could then return together to Aix. The proposal fitted well with Madame Dauvray's inclinations. She was in a feverish mood of excitement. "Yes, it will be better that we dine quietly together in a place where there is no noise and no crowd, and where no one knows us," she said, and she looked up the timetable. "There is a train back which reaches Aix at 9 o'clock," she said, "so we need not spoil Servettaz's holiday." "His parents will be expecting him," Helene Vauquier added. Accordingly, Servettaz left for Chambéry by the 1:50 train from Aix, and later on in the afternoon Madame Dauvray and Celia went by train to Annecy. In the one woman's mind there was the queer longing that she should appear and speak tonight. In the girl's there was a wish, passionate as a cry. "This shall be the last time," she said to herself again and again, "the very last." Meanwhile, Helene Vauquier, it must be held, burned carefully Adèle Tasse's letter. She was left in the Villa Rose with the charwoman to keep her company. The charwoman bore testimony that Helene Vauquier certainly did burn a letter in the kitchen stove, and that after she had burned it she sat for a long time rocking herself in a chair, with a smile of great pleasure upon her face, and now and then moistening her lips with her tongue. But Helene Vauquier kept her mouth sealed. End of chapter 16. Of At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. The Afternoon of Tuesday. Madame Dauvray and Celia found Adèle Rossignol, to give Adèle Tasse the name which she assumed, waiting for them impatiently in the garden of a hotel at Annecy on the Promenade du Paquier. She was a tall, lithe woman, and she was dressed, by the purse and wish of Helene Vauquier, in a robe and a long coat of sapphire velvet, which toned down the coarseness of her good looks and lent something of elegance to her figure. "So it is mademoiselle," Adèle began with a smile of raillery, "who is so remarkably clever." "Clever?" answered Celia, looking straight at Adèle, as though through her she saw mysteries beyond. She took up her part at once. Since for the last time it had got to be played, there must be no fault in the playing. For her own sake, for the sake of Madame Dauvray's happiness, she must carry it off tonight with success. The suspicions of Adèle Rossignol must obtain no verification. She spoke in a quiet and most serious voice. Under spirit control no one is clever. One does the bidding of the spirit which controls. Perfectly, said Adèle in a malicious tone. I only hope you will see to it, mademoiselle, that some amusing spirits control you this evening and appear before us. I am only the living gate by which the spirit's forms pass from the realm of mind into the world of matter, Celia replied. Quite so, said Adèle comfortably. Now, let us be sensible and dine. We can amuse ourselves with mademoiselle's rigmaroles afterwards. Madame Dauvray was indignant. Celia, for her part, felt humiliated and small. They sat down to their dinner in the garden, but the rain began to fall and drove them indoors. There were a few people dining at the same hour, but none near enough to overhear them. Alike in the garden and the dining-room, Adèle Tasse kept up the same note of ridicule and disbelief. She had been carefully tutored for her work. She was able to cite the stock cases of exposure, les frères Davenport, as she called them, Eusapia Palladino and Dr. Slade. She knew the precautions which had been taken to prevent trickery, and where those precautions had failed. Her whole conversation was carefully planned to one end, and to one end alone. She wished to produce in the minds of her companions so complete an impression of her scepticism that it would seem the most natural thing in the world to both of them that she should insist upon subjecting Celia to the severest tests. The rain ceased, and they took their coffee on the terrace of the hotel. Madame Dauvray had been really pained by the conversation of Adèle Tasse. She had all the missionary zeal of a fanatic. I do hope, Adèle, that we shall make you believe. But we shall. Oh, I am confident we shall. And her voice was feverish. Adèle dropped for the moment her tone of raillery. I am not unwilling to believe, she said, but I cannot. I am interested, yes. You see how much I have studied the subject. But I cannot believe. I have heard stories of how these manifestations are produced, stories which make me laugh. I cannot help it. The tricks are so easy. A young girl wearing a black frock which does not rustle. It is always a black frock, is it not, because a black frock cannot be seen in the dark? Carrying a scarf or veil, with which she can make any sort of headdress, if only she is a little clever, and shod in a pair of felt-soled slippers, is shut up in a cabinet or placed behind a screen, and the lights are turned down or out. Adèle broke off with a comic shrug of the shoulders. Bah! It ought not to deceive a child. Celia sat with a face which would grow red. She did not look, but none the less she was aware that Madame Dauvray was gazing at her with a perplexed frown, and some return of her suspicion showing in her eyes. Adèle Tasse was not content to leave the subject there. Perhaps, she said with a smile, Mademoiselle Celie dresses in that way for a séance? Madame shall see tonight, Celia stammered, and Camille Dauvray rather sternly repeated her words. Yes, Adèle shall see tonight. I myself will decide what you shall wear, Celie. Adèle Tasse casually suggested the kind of dress which she would prefer. Something light in colour, with a train, something which will hiss and whisper if mademoiselle moves about the room. Yes, and I think one of mademoiselle's big hats, she said. We will have mademoiselle as modern as possible, so that when the great ladies of the past appear in the coiffure of their day, we may be sure it is not Mademoiselle Celie who represents them. I will speak to Hélène, said Madame Dauvray, and Adèle Tasse was content. There was a particular new dress of which she knew, and it was very desirable that Mademoiselle Celie should wear it tonight. For one thing, if Celia wore it, it would help the theory that she had put it on because she expected that night a lover. For another, with that dress there went a pair of satin slippers which had just come home from a shoemaker at Aix, and which would leave upon soft mould precisely the same imprints as the grey suede shoes which the girl was wearing now. Celia was not greatly disconcerted by Madame Rossignol's precautions. She would have to be a little more careful, and Madame de Montespan would be a little longer in responding to the call of Madame Dauvray than most of the other dead ladies of the past had been. But that was all. She was, however, really troubled in another way. All through dinner, at every word of the conversation, she had felt her reluctance towards this séance swelling into a positive disgust. More than once she had felt driven by some uncontrollable power to rise up at the table and cry out to Adèle, "You are right. It is trickery. There is no truth in it." But she had mastered herself, for opposite to her sat her patroness, her good friend, the woman who had saved her. The flush upon Madame Dauvray's cheeks and the agitation of her manner warned Celia how much hung on the success of this last séance, how much for both of them. And in the fullness of that knowledge a great fear assailed her. She began to be afraid, so strong was her reluctance, that she would not bring her heart into the task. "Suppose I failed tonight because I could not force myself to wish not to fail," she thought, and she steeled herself against the thought. Tonight she must not fail, for apart altogether from Madame Dauvray's happiness, her own, it seemed, was at stake too. "It must be from my lips that Harry learns what I have been," she said to herself, and with the resolve she strengthened herself. "I will wear what you please," she said with a smile. "I only wish Madame Rossignol to be satisfied." "And I shall be," said Adèle, "if—" She leaned forward in anxiety. She had come to the real necessity of Helene Vauquier's plan. "If we abandon as quite laughable the cupboard door and the string across it, if, in a word, Mademoiselle consents that we tie her hand and foot and fasten her securely in a chair. Such restraints are usual in the experiments of which I have read. Was there not a medium called Mademoiselle Cook who was secured in this way, and then remarkable things which I could not believe were supposed to have happened?" "Certainly I permit it," said Celia with indifference, and Madame Dauvray cried enthusiastically, "Ah, you shall believe tonight in those wonderful things." Adèle Tace leaned back. She drew a breath. It was a breath of relief. "Then we will buy the cord in Aix," she said. "We have some, no doubt, in the house," said Madame Dauvray. Adèle shook her head and smiled. "My dear madame, you are dealing with a sceptic. I should not be content." Celia shrugged her shoulders. "Let us satisfy Madame Rossignol," she said. Celia indeed was not alarmed by this last precaution. For her it was a test less difficult than the light-coloured rustling robe. She had appeared upon so many platforms, had experienced too often the bungling efforts of spectators called up from the audience to be in any fear. There were very few knots from which her small hands and supple fingers had not learned long since to extricate themselves. She was aware how much in all these matters the personal equation counted. Men who might perhaps have been able to tie knots from whom she could not get free were always too uncomfortable and self-conscious, or too afraid of hurting her white arms and wrists to do it. Women, on the other hand, who had no compunctions of that kind, did not know how. It was now nearly 8 o'clock. The rain still held off. "We must go," said Madame Dauvray, who for the last half-hour had been continually looking at her watch. They drove to the station and took the train. Once more the rain came down, but it had stopped again before the train steamed into Aix at 9 o'clock. "We will take a cab," said Madame Dauvray. "It will save time." "It will do us good to walk, madame," pleaded Adèle. The train was full. Adèle passed quickly out from the lights of the station in the throng of passengers and waited in the dark square for the others to join her. "It is barely 9. A friend has promised to call at the Villa Rose for me after 11 and drive me back in a motor car to Geneva, so we have plenty of time." They walked accordingly up the hill, Madame Dauvray slowly, since she was stout, and Celia keeping pace with her. Thus it seemed natural that Adèle Tace should walk ahead, though a passer-by would not have thought she was of their company. At the corner of the Rue du Casino, Adèle waited for them and said quickly, "Mademoiselle, you can get some cord, I think, at the shop there," and she pointed to the shop of Monsieur Corval. "Madame and I will go slowly on. You, who are the youngest, will easily catch us up." Celia went into the shop, bought the cord, and caught Madame Dauvray up before she reached the villa. "Where is Madame Rossignol?" she asked. "She went on," said Camille Dauvray. "She walks faster than I do." They passed no one whom they knew, although they did pass one who recognized them, as Perrichet had discovered. They came upon Adèle waiting for them at the corner of the road where it turns down toward the villa. "It is near here, the Villa Rose?" she asked. "A minute more and we are there." They turned in at the drive, closed the gate behind them, and walked up to the villa. The windows and the glass doors were closed, the latticed shutters fastened. A light burned in the hall. "Helene is expecting us," said Madame Dauvray, for as they approached she saw the front door open to admit them, and Helene Vauquier was in the doorway. The three women went straight into the little salon, which was ready with the lights up and a small fire burning. Celia noticed the fire with a trifle of dismay. She moved a fire screen in front of it. "I can understand why you do that, mademoiselle," said Adèle Rossignol with a satirical smile. But Madame Dauvray came to the girl's help. "She is right, Adèle. Light is the great barrier between us and the spirit world," she said solemnly. Meanwhile, in the hall, Helene Vauquier locked and bolted the front door. Then she stood motionless with a smile upon her face and a heart beating high. All through that afternoon she had been afraid that some accident at the last moment would spoil her plan, that Adèle Tasse had not learned her lesson, that Celie would take fright, that she would not return. Now all those fears were over. She had her victims safe within the villa. The charwoman had been sent home. She had them to herself. She was still standing in the hall when Madame Dauvray called aloud impatiently, "Helene! Helene!" And when she entered the salon there was still, as Celia was able to recall, some trace of her smile lingering upon her face. Adèle Rossignol had removed her hat and was taking off her gloves. Madame Dauvray was speaking impatiently to Celia. "We will arrange the room, dear, while Helene helps you to dress. It will be quite easy. We shall use the recess." And Celia, as she ran up the stairs, heard Madame Dauvray discussing with her maid what frock she should wear. She was hot, and she took a hurried bath. When she came from her bathroom, she saw with dismay that it was her new pale green evening gown which had been laid out. It was the last which she would have chosen, but she dared not refuse it. She must still any suspicion. She must succeed. She gave herself into Helene's hands. Celia remembered afterwards one or two points which passed barely heeded at the time. Once, while Helene was dressing her hair, she looked up at the maid in the mirror and noticed a strange and rather horrible grin upon her face, which disappeared the moment their eyes met. Then again, Helene was extraordinarily slow and extraordinarily fastidious that evening. Nothing satisfied her, neither the hang of the girl's skirt, the folds of her sash, nor the arrangement of her hair. "Come, Helene, be quick," said Celia. "You know how Madame hates to be kept waiting at these times. You might be dressing me to go to meet my lover," she added, with a blush and a smile at her own pretty reflection in the glass. And a queer look came upon Helene Vauquier's face, for it was at creating just this very impression that she aimed. "Very well, mademoiselle," said Helene, and even as she spoke Madame Dauvray's voice rang shrill and irritable up the stairs. "Celie! Celie!" "Quick, Helene," said Celia, for she herself was now anxious to have the séance over and done with. But Helene did not hurry. The more irritable Madame Dauvray became, the more impatient with Mademoiselle Celie, the less would Mademoiselle Celie dare to refuse the tests Adèle wished to impose upon her. But that was not all. She took a subtle and ironic pleasure tonight in decking out her victim's natural loveliness. Her face, her slender throat, her white shoulders should look their prettiest. Her grace of limb and figure should be more alluring than ever before. The same words, indeed, were running through both women's minds. "For the last time," said Celia to herself, thinking of these horrible séances, of which tonight should see the end. "For the last time," said Helene Vauquier too. For the last time she laced the girl's dress. There would be no more patient and careful service for Mademoiselle Celie after tonight. But she should have it and to spare tonight. She should be conscious that her beauty had never made so strong an appeal, that she was never so fit for life as at that moment when the end had come. One thing Helene regretted. She would have liked Celia, smiling at herself in the glass, to know suddenly what was in store for her. She saw in imagination the colour die from the cheeks, the eyes stare wide with terror. "Celie! Celie!" Again the impatient voice rang up the stairs as Helene pinned the girl's hat upon her fair head. Celie sprang up and took a quick step or two towards the door, and stopped in dismay. The swish of her long satin train must betray her. She caught up the dress and tried again. Even so the rustle of it was heard. "I shall have to be very careful. You will help me, Helene?" "Of course, mademoiselle. I will sit underneath the switch of the light in the salon. If madame, your visitor, makes the experiment too difficult, I will find a way to help you," said Helene Vauquier, and as she spoke she handed Celia a long pair of white gloves. "I shall not want them," said Celia. "Madame Dauvray ordered me to give them to you," replied Helene. Celia took them hurriedly, picked up a white scarf of tulle, and ran down the stairs. Helene Vauquier listened at the door and heard Madame's voice in feverish anger. "We have been waiting for you, Celie. You have been an age." Helene Vauquier laughed softly to herself, took out Celia's white frock from the wardrobe, turned off the lights, and followed her down to the hall. She placed the cloak just outside the door of the salon. Then she carefully turned out all the lights in the hall and in the kitchen and went into the salon. The rest of the house was in darkness. This room was brightly lit, and it had been made ready. End of chapter 17. Of At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. The Séance. Helene Vauquier locked the door of the salon upon the inside and placed the key upon the mantel-shelf, as she had always done whenever a séance had been held. The curtains had been loosened at the sides of the archived recess in front of the glass doors, ready to be drawn across. Inside the recess, against one of the pillars which supported the arch, a high stool without a back, taken from the hall, had been placed, and the back legs of the stool had been lashed with cord firmly to the pillar so that it could not be moved. The round table had been put in position with 3 chairs about it. Madame Dauvray waited impatiently. Celia stood, apparently unconcerned, apparently lost to all that was going on. Her eyes saw no one. Adèle looked up at Celia and laughed maliciously. "Mademoiselle, I see, is in the very mood to produce the most wonderful phenomena. But it will be better, I think, madame," she said, turning to Madame Dauvray, "that Mademoiselle Celie should put on those gloves, which I see she has thrown onto a chair. It will be a little more difficult for Mademoiselle to loosen these cords, should she wish to do so." The argument silenced Celia. If she refused this condition now, she would excite Madame Dauvray to a terrible suspicion. She drew on her gloves ruefully and slowly, smoothed them over her elbows and buttoned them. To free her hands with her fingers and wrists already hampered in gloves would not be so easy a task. But there was no escape. Adèle Rossignol was watching her with a satiric smile. Madame Dauvray was urging her to be quick. Obeying a second order, the girl raised her skirt and extended a slim foot in a pale green silk stocking and a satin slipper to match. Adèle was content. Celia was wearing the shoes she was meant to wear. They were made upon the very same last as those which Celia had just kicked off upstairs. An almost imperceptible nod from Helene Vauquier, moreover, assured her. She took up a length of the thin cord. "Now, how are we to begin?" she said awkwardly. "I think I will ask you, mademoiselle, to put your hands behind you." Celia turned her back and crossed her wrists. She stood in her satin frock with her white arms and shoulders bare, her slender throat supporting her small head with its heavy curls, her big hat, a picture of young grace and beauty. She would have had an easy task that night had there been men instead of women to put her to the test. But the women were intent upon their own ends. Madame Dauvray, eager for her séance, Adèle Tasse and Helene Vauquier for the climax of their plot. Celia clenched her hands to make the muscles of her wrists rigid, to resist the pressure of the cord. Adèle quietly unclasped them and placed them palm to palm. And at once Celia became uneasy. It was not merely the action, significant though it was, of Adèle's alertness to thwart her, which troubled Celia, but she was extraordinarily receptive of impressions, extraordinarily quick to feel, from a touch, from some dim sensation of the thought of the one who touched her. So now the touch of Adèle's swift, strong, nervous hands caused her a queer, vague shock of discomfort. It was no more than that at the moment, but it was quite definite as that. "Keep your hands so, please, mademoiselle," said Adèle. "Your fingers loose." And the next moment Celia winced and had to bite her lip to prevent a cry. The thin cord was wound twice about her wrists, drawn cruelly tight and then cunningly knotted. For 1 second Celia was thankful for her gloves. The next, more than ever, she regretted that she wore them. It would have been difficult enough for her to free her hands now even without them. And upon that a worse thing befell her. "I beg mademoiselle's pardon if I hurt her," said Adèle. And she tied the girl's thumbs and little fingers. To slacken the knots she must have the use of her fingers, even though her gloves made them fumble. Now she had lost the use of them altogether. She began to feel that she was in master hands. She was sure of it the next instant, for Adèle stood up, and passing a cord around the upper part of her arms, drew her elbows back. To bring any strength to help her in wriggling her hands free, she must be able to raise her elbows. With them trussed in the small of her back, she was robbed entirely of her strength, and all the time her strange uneasiness grew. She made a movement of revolt, and at once the cord was loosened. "Mademoiselle Celie objects to my test," said Adèle, with a laugh, to Madame Dauvray, "and I do not wonder." Celia saw upon the old woman's foolish and excited face a look of veritable consternation. "Are you afraid, Celie?" she asked. There was anger, there was menace in the voice, but above all these there was fear, fear that her illusions were to tumble about her. Celia heard that note and was quelled by it. This folly of belief, these séances, were the one touch of colour in Madame Dauvray's life, and it was just that instinctive need of colour which had made her so easy to delude. How strong the need is, how seductive the proposal to supply it, Celia knew well. She knew it from the experience of her life, when the great Fortinbras was at the climax of his fortunes. She had travelled much amongst monotonous, drab towns, without character or amusements. She had kept her eyes open. She had seen that it was from the denizens of the dull streets in these towns that the quack religions won their recruits. Madame Dauvray's life had been a featureless sort of affair until these experiments had come to colour it. Madame Dauvray must at any rate preserve the memory of that colour. "No," she said boldly, "I am not afraid," and after that she moved no more. Her elbows were drawn firmly back and tightly bound. She was sure she could not free them. She glanced in despair at Helene Vauquier, and then some glimmer of hope sprang up. For Helene Vauquier gave her a look, a smile of reassurance. It was as if she said, "I will come to your help." Then, to make security still more sure, Adèle turned the girl about as unceremoniously as if she had been a doll, and passing a cord at the back of her arms, drew both ends round in front and knotted them at her waist. "Now, Celie," said Adèle, with a vibration in her voice which Celia had not remarked before. Excitement was gaining upon her, as upon Madame Dauvray. Her face was flushed and shiny, her manner peremptory and quick. Celia's uneasiness grew into fear. She could have used the words which Hanaud spoke the next day in that very room. "There is something here which I do not understand." The touch of Adèle Tasse's hands communicated something to her, something which filled her with a vague alarm. She could not have formulated it if she would. She dared not if she could. She had but to stand and submit. "Now," said Adèle. She took the girl by the shoulders and set her in a clear space in the middle of the room, her back to the recess, her face to the mirror, where all could see her. "Now, Celie," she had dropped the mademoiselle and the ironic suavity of her manner, "try to free yourself." For a moment the girl's shoulders worked, her hands fluttered, but they remained helplessly bound. "Ah, you will be content, Adèle, tonight. cried Madame Dauvray eagerly. But even in the midst of her eagerness, so thoroughly had she been prepared, there lingered a flavour of doubt, of suspicion. In Celia's mind there was still the one desperate resolve. "I must succeed tonight," she said to herself. "I must." Adèle Rossignol kneeled on the floor behind her. She gathered in carefully the girl's frock. Then she picked up the long train, wound it tightly round her limbs, pinioning and swathing it in the folds of satin, and secured the folds with a cord about the knees. She stood up again. "Can you walk, Celie?" she asked. "Try." With Helene Vauquier to support her if she fell, Celia took a tiny shuffling step forward, feeling supremely ridiculous. No one, however, of her audience was inclined to laugh. To Madame Dauvray the whole business was as serious as the most solemn ceremonial. Adèle was intent upon making her knot secure. Helene Vauquier was the well-bred servant who knew her place. It was not for her to laugh at her young mistress, in however ludicrous a situation she might be. "Now," said Adèle, "we will tie mademoiselle's ankles, and then we shall be ready for Madame de Montespan." The raillery in her voice had a note of savagery in it now. Celia's vague terror grew. She had a feeling that a beast was waking in the woman, and with it came a growing premonition of failure. Vainly she cried to herself, "I must not fail tonight." But she felt instinctively that there was a stronger personality than her own in that room, taming her, condemning her to failure, influencing the others. She was placed in a chair. Adèle passed a cord round her ankles, and the mere touch of it quickened Celia to a spasm of revolt. Her last little remnant of liberty was being taken from her. She raised herself, or rather would have raised herself, but Helene, with gentle hands, held her in the chair and whispered under her breath, "Have no fear, Madame is watching." Adèle looked fiercely up into the girl's face. "Keep still, huh, la petite?" she cried. And the epithet, little one, was a light to Celia. Till now, upon these occasions, with her black ceremonial dress, her air of aloofness, her vague eyes, and the dignity of her carriage, she had already produced some part of their effect before the séance had begun. She had been wont to sail into the room, distant, mystical. She had her audience already expectant of mysteries, prepared for marvels. Her work was already half done. But now, of all that help, she was deprived. She was no longer a person aloof, a prophetess, a seer of visions. She was simply a smartly dressed girl of today, trussed up in a ridiculous and painful position. That was all. The dignity was gone. And the more she realized that, the more she was hindered from influencing her audience, the less able she was to concentrate her mind upon them, to will them to favor her. Madame Dauvray's suspicions, she was sure, were still awake. She could not quell them. There was a stronger personality than hers at work in the room. The cord bit through her thin stockings into her ankles. She dared not complain. It was savagely tied. She made no remonstrance. And then Helene Vauquier raised her up from the chair and lifted her easily off the ground. For a moment she held her so. If Celia had felt ridiculous before, she knew that she was 10 times more so now. She could see herself as she hung in Helene Vauquier's arms, with her delicate frock ludicrously swathed and swaddled about her legs. But again, of those who watched her, no one smiled. "We have had no such tests as these," Madame Dauvray explained, half in fear, half in hope. Adèle Rossignol looked the girl over and nodded her head with satisfaction. She had no animosity towards Celia. She had really no feeling of any kind for her or against her. Fortunately, she was unaware at this time that Harry Wethermill had been paying his court to her, or it would have gone worse with Mademoiselle Celie before the night was out. Mademoiselle Celie was just a pawn in a very dangerous game which she happened to be playing, and she had succeeded in engineering her pawn into the desired condition of helplessness. She was content. "Mademoiselle," she said with a smile, "you wish me to believe. You have now your opportunity." Opportunity! And she was helpless. She knew very well that she could never free herself from these cords without Hélène's help. She would fail, miserably and shamefully fail. It was Madame who wished you to believe," she stammered. And Adèle Rossignol laughed suddenly, a short, loud, harsh laugh, which jarred upon the quiet of the room. It turned Celia's vague alarm into a definite terror. Some magnetic current brought her grave messages of fear. The air about her seemed to tingle with strange menaces. She looked at Adèle. Did they emanate from her? And her terror answered her, yes. She made her mistake in that. The strong personality in the room was not Adèle Rossignol, but Helene Vauquier, who held her like a child in her arms. But she was definitely aware of danger, and too late aware of it. She struggled vainly. From her head to her feet she was powerless. She cried out hysterically to her patron, "Madame, Madame, there is something, a presence here, someone who means harm. I know it." And upon the old woman's face there came a look, not of alarm, but of extraordinary relief. The genuine, heartfelt cry restored her confidence in Celia. "Someone who means harm," she whispered, trembling with excitement. "Ah, mademoiselle is already under control," said Helene, using the jargon which she had learnt from Celia's lips. Adèle Rossignol grinned. "Yes, la petite is under control," she repeated with a sneer, and all the elegance of her velvet gown was unable to hide her any longer from Celia's knowledge. Her grin had betrayed her. She was of the dregs. But Helene Vauquier whispered, "Keep still, mademoiselle. I shall help you." Vauquier carried the girl into the recess and placed her upon the stool. With a long cord Adèle bound her by the arms and the waist to the pillar, and her ankle she fastened to the rung of the stool so that they could not touch the ground. "Thus we shall be sure that when we hear rapping, it will be the spirits and not the heels which rap," she said. "Yes, I am contented now." And she added with a smile, "Celie may even have her scarf." And, picking up a white scarf of tulle, which Celia had brought down with her, she placed it carelessly round her shoulders. "Wait," Helene Vauquier whispered in Celia's ear. To the cord about Celia's waist Adèle was fastening along a line. "I shall keep my foot on the other end of this," she said, "when the lights are out, and I shall know then if our little one frees herself." The three women went out of the recess, and the next moment the heavy silk curtains swung across the opening, leaving Celia in darkness. Quickly and noiselessly the poor girl began to twist and work her hands, but she only bruised her wrists. This was to be the last of the séances, but it must succeed. So much of Madame Dauvray's happiness, so much of her own, hung upon its success. Let her fail tonight, she would be surely turned from the door. The story of her trickery and her exposure would run through Aix, and she had not told Harry. It would reach his ears from others. He would never forgive her. To face the old, difficult life of poverty and perhaps starvation again and again alone would be hard enough, but to face it with Harry Wethermill's contempt added to its burdens, as the poor girl believed she surely would have to do, no, that would be impossible. Not this time would she turn away from the Seine, because it was so terrible and cold. If she had had the courage to tell him yesterday, he would have forgiven. Surely he would. The tears gathered in her eyes and rolled down her cheeks. What would become of her now? She was in pain besides. The cords about her arms and ankles tortured her. And she feared, yes, desperately, she feared the effect of the exposure upon Madame Dauvray. She had been treated as a daughter. Now she was in return to rob Madame Dauvray of the belief which had become the passion of her life. "Let us take our seats at the table," she heard Madame Dauvray say. "Hélène, you are by the switch of the electric light. Will you turn it off?" And upon that Hélène whispered, yet so the whisper reached to Celia and awakened hope. "Wait, I will see what she is doing." The curtains opened, and Helene Vauquier slipped to the girl's side. Celia checked her tears. She smiled, imploringly, gratefully. "What shall I do?" asked Hélène, in a voice so low that the movement of her mouth, rather than the words, made the question clear. Celia raised her head to answer, and then a thing incomprehensible to her happened. As she opened her lips, Helene Vauquier swiftly forced a handkerchief in between the girl's teeth and, lifting the scarf from her shoulders, wound it tightly twice across her mouth, binding her lips, and made it fast under the brim of her hat behind her head. Celia tried to scream. She could not utter a sound. She stared at Helene with incredulous, horror-stricken eyes. Helene nodded at her with a cruel grin of satisfaction, and Celia realized, though she did not understand, something of the rancour and the hatred which seethed against her in the heart of the woman whom she had supplanted. Helene Vauquier meant to expose her tonight. Celia had not a doubt of it. That was her explanation of Helene Vauquier's treachery, and believing that error, she believed yet another, that she had reached the terrible climax of her troubles. She was only at the beginning of them. "Helene!" cried Madame Dauvray sharply. "What are you doing?" The maid instantly slid back into the room. "Mademoiselle has not moved," she said. Celia heard the women settle in their chairs about the table. "Is Madame ready?" asked Helene, and then there was the sound of the snap of a switch. In the salon darkness had come. If only she had not been wearing her gloves, Celia thought, she might possibly have just been able to free her fingers and her supple hands from their bonds. But as it was, she was helpless. She could only sit and wait until the audience in the salon grew tired of waiting and came to her. She closed her eyes, pondering if by any chance she could excuse her failure, but her heart sank within her as she thought of Madame Rossignol's raillery. No, it was all over for her. She opened her eyes and she wondered. It seemed to her that there was more light in the recess than there had been when she closed them. Very likely her eyes were growing used to the darkness. Yet she ought not to be able to distinguish quite so clearly the white pillar opposite to her. She looked towards the glass doors and understood. The wooden shutters outside the doors were not quite closed. They had been carelessly left unbolted. A chink from lintel to floor let in a grey thread of light. Celia heard the women whispering in the salon and turned her head to catch the words. "Did you hear any sound?" "No." "Was that a hand which touched me?" "No." "We must wait." And so silence came again, and suddenly there was quite a rush of light into the recess. Celia was startled. She turned her head back again towards the window. The wooden door had swung a little more open. There was a wider chink to let the twilight of that starlit darkness through. And as she looked, the chink slowly broadened and broadened. The door swung slowly back on hinges, which were strangely silent. Celia stared at that widening panel of grey light with a vague terror. It was strange that she could hear no whisper of wind in the garden. Why, oh why, was that latticed door opening so noiselessly? Almost she believed that the spirits, after all. And suddenly the recess darkened again, and Celia sat with her heart leaping and shivering in her breast. There was something black against the glass doors. A man. He had appeared as silently, as suddenly, as any apparition. He stood blocking out the light, pressing his face against the glass, peering into the room. For a moment the shock of horror stunned her. Then she tore frantically at the cords. All thought of failure, of exposure, of dismissal had fled from her. The three poor women, that was her thought, were sitting unwarned, unsuspecting, defenceless in the pitch blackness of the salon. A few feet away a man, a thief, was peering in. They were waiting for strange things to happen in the darkness. Strange and terrible things would happen unless she could free herself, unless she could warn them. And she could not. Her struggles were mere efforts to struggle, futile, a shiver from head to foot, and noiseless as a shiver. Adèle Rossignol had done her work well and thoroughly. Celia's arms, her waist, her ankles were pinioned. Only the bandage over her mouth seemed to be loosening. Then, upon horror, horror was added. The man touched the glass doors, and they swung silently inwards. They, too, had been carelessly left unbolted. The man stepped without a sound over the sill into the room, and as he stepped, fear for herself drove out for the moment from Celia's thoughts fear for the three women in the black room. If only he did not see her! She pressed herself against the pillar. He might overlook her, perhaps. His eyes would not be so accustomed to the darkness of the recess as hers. He might pass her unnoticed, if only he did not touch some fold of her dress. And then, in the midst of her terror, she experienced so great a revulsion from despair to joy that a faintness came upon her, and she almost swooned. She saw who the intruder was, for when he stepped into the recess he turned towards her, and the dim light struck upon him and showed her the contour of his face. It was her lover, Harry Wethermill. Why he had come at this hour, and in this strange way, she did not consider. Now she must attract his eyes. Now her fear was lest he should not see her. But he came at once straight towards her. He stood in front of her, looking into her eyes. But he uttered no cry. He made no movement of surprise. Celia did not understand it. His face was in the shadow now, and she could not see it. Of course he was stunned, amazed. But he stood almost as if he had expected to find her there, and just in that helpless attitude. It was absurd, of course, but he seemed to look upon her helplessness as nothing out of the ordinary way, and he raised no hand to set her free. A chill struck through her, but the next moment he did raise his hand, and the blood flowed again at her heart. Of course she was in the darkness. He had not seen her plight. Even now he was only beginning to be aware of it, for his hand touched the bandage over her mouth, tentatively. He felt for the knot under the broad brim of her hat at the back of her head. He found it. In a moment she would be free. She kept her head quite still, and then, why was he so long? She asked herself. Oh, it was not possible. But her heart seemed to stop, and she knew that it was not only possible, it was true. He was tightening the scarf, not loosening it. The folds bound her lips more surely. She felt the ends drawn close at the back of her head. In a frenzy she tried to shake her head free, but he held her face firmly and finished his work. He was wearing gloves, she noticed with horror, just as thieves do. Then his hands slid down her trembling arms and tested the cord about her wrists. There was something horribly deliberate about his movements. Celia, even at that moment, even with him, had the sensation which had possessed her in the salon. It was the personal equation on which she was used to rely. But neither Adèle nor this stranger, was considering her as even a human being. She was a pawn in their game, and they used her, careless of her terror, her beauty, her pain. Then he freed from her waist the long cord which ran beneath the curtain to Adèle Rossignol's foot. Celia's first thought was one of relief. He would jerk the cord unwittingly. They would come into the recess and see him. And then the real truth flashed in upon her blindingly. He had jerked the cord, but he had jerked it deliberately. He was already winding it up in a coil as it slid noiselessly across the polished floor beneath the curtains towards him. He had given a signal to Adèle Rossignol. All that woman's skepticism and precaution against trickery had been a mere blind, under cover of which she had been able to pack the girl away securely without arousing her suspicions. Hélène Vauquier was in the plot too. The scarf at Celia's mouth was proof of that. As if to add proof to proof, she heard Adèle Rossignol speak in answer to the signal. "Are we all ready? Have you got Madame Dauvray's left hand, Hélène?" "Yes, madame," answered the maid. "And I have her right hand. Now give me yours, and thus we are in a circle about the table." Celia, in her mind, could see them sitting about the round table in the darkness, Madame Dauvray between the two women, securely held by them. And she herself could not utter a cry, could not move a muscle to help her. Wethermill crept back on noiseless feet to the window, closed the wooden doors, and slid the bolts into their sockets. Yes, Hélène Vauquier was in the plot. The bolts and the hinges would not have worked so smoothly but for her. Darkness again filled the recess instead of the grey twilight. But in a moment a faint breath of wind played upon Celia's forehead, and she knew that the man had parted the curtains and slipped into the room. Celia let her head fall towards her shoulder. She was sick and faint with terror. Her lover was in this plot, the lover in whom she had felt so much pride, for whose sake she had taken herself so bitterly to task. He was the associate of Adèle Rossignol, of Hélène Vauquier. He had used her, Celia, as an instrument for his crime. All their hours together at the Villa des Fleurs, here tonight was their culmination. The blood buzzed in her ears and hammered in the veins of her temples. In front of her eyes the darkness whirled, flecked with fire. She would have fallen, but she could not fall. Then, in the silence, a tambourine jangled. There was to be a séance tonight then, and the séance had begun. In dreadful suspense she heard Madame Dauvray speak. End of chapter 18. Of At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Hélène Explains. And what she heard made her blood run cold. Madame Dauvray spoke in a hushed, awestruck voice. There is a presence in the room. It was horrible to Celia that the poor woman was speaking the jargon which she herself had taught to her. I will speak to it, said Madame Dauvray, and raising her voice a little she asked, Who are you that come to us from the spirit world? No answer came, but all the while Celia knew that Wethermill was stealing noiselessly across the floor towards that voice which spoke this professional patter with so simple a solemnity. Answer, she said, and the next moment she uttered a little shrill cry, a cry of enthusiasm. Fingers touch my forehead, now they touch my cheek, now they touch my throat. And upon that the voice ceased, but a dry, choking sound was heard, and a horrible scuffling and tapping of feet upon the polished floor, a sound most dreadful. They were murdering her, murdering an old, kind woman silently and methodically in the darkness. The girl strained and twisted against the pillar furiously, like an animal in a trap, but the coils of rope held her. The scarf suffocated her. The scuffling became a spasmodic sound, with intervals between, and then ceased altogether. A voice spoke, a man's voice, Wethermill's. But Celia would never have recognized it. It had so shrill and fearful an intonation. That's horrible, he said, and his voice suddenly rose to a scream. Hush, Hélène Vauquier whispered sharply. What's the matter? She fell against me, her whole weight. Oh! You are afraid of her? Yes, yes. And in the darkness Wethermill's voice came querulously between long breaths. Yes, now I am afraid of her. Hélène Vauquier replied again contemptuously. She spoke aloud and quite indifferently. Nothing of any importance whatever, one would have gathered, had occurred. I will turn on the light, she said, and through the chinks in the curtain the bright light shone. Celia heard a loud rattle upon the table, and then fainter sounds of the same kind, and as a kind of horrible accompaniment there ran the laboured breathing of the man, which broke now and then with a sobbing sound. They were stripping Madame Dauvray of her pearl necklace, her bracelets, and her rings. Celia had a sudden importunate vision of the old woman's fat, podgy hands loaded with brilliants. A jingle of keys followed. That's all, Hélène Vauquier said. She might have just turned out the pocket of an old dress. There was the sound of something heavy and inert falling with a dull crash upon the floor. A woman laughed, and again it was Hélène Vauquier. Which is the key to the safe? Asked Adèle. And Hélène Vauquier replied, That one. Celia heard someone drop heavily into a chair. It was Wethermill, and he buried his face in his hands. Hélène went over to him and laid her hand upon his shoulder and shook him. Do you go and get her jewels out of the safe, she said, and she spoke with a rough friendliness. You promised you would blindfold the girl, he cried hoarsely. Hélène Vauquier laughed. Did I? She said. Well, what does it matter? There would have been no need to... And his voice broke off shudderingly. Wouldn't there? And what of us, Adèle and me? She knows certainly that we are here. Come, go and get the jewels. The key of the door's on the mantel-shelf. While you are away, we too will arrange the pretty baby in there." She pointed to the recess. Her voice rang with contempt. Wethermill staggered across the room like a drunkard and picked up the key in trembling fingers. Celia heard it turn in the lock and the door bang. Wethermill had gone upstairs. Celia leaned back, her heart fainting within her. Arrange! It was her turn now. She was to be arranged. She had no doubt what sinister meaning that innocent word concealed. The dry, choking sound, the horrid scuffling of feet upon the floor were in her ears, and it had taken so long, so terribly long. She heard the door open again and shut again. Then steps approached the recess. The curtains were flung back, and the two women stood in front of her. The tall Adèle Rossignol, with her red hair and her coarse good looks and her sapphire dress, and the hard-featured, sallow maid. The maid was carrying Celia's white coat. They did not mean to murder her then. They meant to take her away, and even then a spark of hope lit up in the girl's bosom. For even with her illusions crushed, she still clung to life with all the passion of her young soul. The two women stood and looked at her, and then Adèle Rossignol burst out laughing. Vauquier approached the girl, and Celia had a moment's hope that she meant to free her altogether, but she only loosed the cords which fixed her to the pillar and the high stool. "Mademoiselle will pardon me for laughing," said Adèle Rossignol politely, "but it was Mademoiselle who invited me to try my hand. And really, for so smart a young lady, Mademoiselle looks too ridiculous." She lifted the girl up and carried her back writhing and struggling into the salon. The whole of the pretty room was within view, but in the embrasure of a window something lay dreadfully still and quiet. Celia held her head averted. But it was there, and though it was there, all the while the women joked and laughed, Adèle Rossignol feverishly, Hélène Vauquier with a real glee most horrible to see. "I beg Mademoiselle not to listen to what Adèle is saying," exclaimed Hélène. And she began to ape in a mincing, extravagant fashion the manner of a saleswoman in a shop. "Mademoiselle has never looked so ravishing. This style is the last word of fashion. It is what there is of the most chic. Of course, Mademoiselle understands that the costume is not intended for playing the piano, nor, indeed, for the ballroom. It leaps to one's eyes that dancing would be difficult. Nor is it intended for much conversation. It is a costume for a mood of quiet reflection. But I assure Mademoiselle that for pretty young ladies who are the favorites of rich old women, it is the style most recommended by the criminal classes." All the woman's bitter rancor against Celia, hidden for months beneath a mask of humility, burst out and ran riot now. She went to Adèle Rossignol's help, and they flung the girl face downwards upon the sofa. Her face struck the cushion at one end, her feet the cushion at the other. The breath was struck out of her body. She lay with her bosom heaving. Hélène Vauquier watched her for a moment with a grin, paying herself now for her respectful speeches and attendance. "Yes, lie quietly and reflect, little fool," she said savagely. "Were you wise to come here and interfere with Hélène Vauquier? Hadn't you better have stayed and danced in your rags at Montmartre? Are the smart frocks and the pretty hats and the good dinners worth the price? Ask yourself these questions, my dainty little friend." She drew up a chair to Celia's side and sat down upon it comfortably. "I will tell you what we are going to do with you, Mademoiselle Celie. Adèle Rossignol and that kind gentleman, Monsieur Wethermill, are going to take you away with them. You will be glad to go, won't you, dearie? For you love Monsieur Wethermill, don't you? Oh, they won't keep you long enough for you to get tired of them. Do not fear. But you will not come back, Mademoiselle Celie. No, you have seen too much tonight, and everyone will think that Mademoiselle Celie helped murder and rob her benefactress. They are certain to suspect someone, so why not you, pretty one?" Celia made no movement. She lay trying to believe that no crime had been committed, that that lifeless body did not lie against the wall. And then she heard in the room above a bed wheeled roughly from its place. The two women heard it too, and looked at one another. "He should look in the safe," said Vauquier. "Go and see what he is doing." and Adèle Rossignol ran from the room. As soon as she was gone, Vauquier followed to the door, listened, closed it gently, and came back. She stooped down. "Mademoiselle Celie," she said, in a smooth, silky voice which terrified the girl more than her harsh tones. "There is just one little thing wrong in your appearance, one tiny little piece of bad taste, if mademoiselle will pardon a poor servant the expression. I did not mention it before Adèle Rossignol. She is so severe in her criticism, is she not? But since we are alone, I will presume to point out to mademoiselle that those diamond eardrops which I see peeping out under the scarf are a little ostentatious in her present predicament. They are a provocation to thieves. Will mademoiselle permit me to remove them?" She caught her by the neck and lifted her up. She pushed the lace scarf up at the side of Celia's head. Celia began to struggle furiously, convulsively. She kicked and writhed, and a little tearing sound was heard. One of her shoe buckles had caught in the thin silk covering of the cushion and slit it. Hélène Vauquier let her fall. She felt composedly in her pocket and drew from it an aluminium flask, the same flask which Le Maire was afterward to snatch up in the bedroom in Geneva. Celia stared at her in dread. She saw the flask flashing in the light. She shrank from it. She wondered what new horror was to grip her. Hélène unscrewed the top and laughed pleasantly. "Mademoiselle Celie is under control," she said. "We shall have to teach her that it is not polite in young ladies to kick." She pressed Celia down with a hand upon her back, and her voice changed. "Lie still," she commanded savagely. "Do you hear? Do you know what this is, Mademoiselle Celie?" And she held the flask towards the girl's face. "This is vitriol, my pretty one. Move, and I'll spoil these smooth white shoulders for you. How would you like that?" Celia shuddered from head to foot, and burying her face in the cushion lay trembling. She would have begged for death upon her knees rather than suffer this horror. She felt Vauquier's fingers lingering with a dreadful caressing touch upon her shoulders and about her throat. She was within an ace of the torture, the disfigurement, and she knew it. She could not pray for mercy. She could only lie quite still, as she was bidden, trying to control the shuddering of her limbs and body. "It would be a good lesson for Mademoiselle Celie," Hélène continued slowly. "I think that if Mademoiselle Celie will forgive the liberty, I ought to inflict it. One little tilt of the flask, and the satin of these pretty shoulders—" She broke off suddenly and listened. Some sound heard outside had given Celia a respite, perhaps more than a respite. Hélène set the flask down upon the table. Her avarice had got the better of her hatred. She roughly plucked the earrings out of the girl's ears. She hid them quickly in the bosom of her dress, with her eye upon the door. She did not see a drop of blood gather on the lobe of Celia's ear and fall into the cushion on which her face was pressed. She had hardly hidden them away before the door opened and Adèle Rossignol burst into the room. "What is the matter?" asked Vauquier. "The safe's empty. We have searched the room. We have found nothing," she cried. "Everything is in the safe," Hélène insisted. "No." The two women ran out of the room and up the stairs. Celia, lying on the settee, heard all the quiet of the house change to noise and confusion. It was as though a tornado raged in the room overhead. Furniture was tossed about and over the room. Feet stamped and ran. Locks were smashed with heavy blows. For many minutes the storm raged. Then it ceased, and she heard the accomplices clattering down the stairs without a thought of the noise they made. They burst into the room. Harry Wethermill was laughing hysterically, like a man off his head. He had been wearing a long dark overcoat when he entered the house. Now he carried the coat over his arm. He was in a dinner jacket, and his black clothes were dusty and disordered. "It's all for nothing!" he screamed rather than cried. "Nothing but the one necklace and a handful of rings." In a frenzy, he actually stooped over the dead woman and questioned her. "Tell us, where did you hide them?" he cried. "The girl will know," said Hélène. Wethermill rose up and looked wildly at Celia. "Yes, yes," he said. He had no scruple, no pity any longer for the girl. There was no gain from the crime unless she spoke. He would have placed his head in the guillotine for nothing. He ran to the writing table, tore off half a sheet of paper, and brought it over with a pencil to the sofa. He gave them to Vauquier to hold, and drawing out the sofa from the wall, slipped in behind. He lifted up Celia with Rossignols' help, and made her sit in the middle of the sofa, with her feet upon the ground. He unbound her wrists and fingers, and Vauquier placed the writing pad and the paper on the girl's knees. Her arms were still pinioned above the elbows. She could not raise her hands high enough to snatch the scarf from her lips. But with the pad held up to her, she could write. "Where did she keep her jewels? Quick, take the pencil and write," said Wethermill, holding her left wrist. Vauquier thrust the pencil into her right hand, and awkwardly and slowly her gloved fingers moved across the page. "I do not know," she wrote, and with an oath Wethermill snatched the paper up, tore it into pieces, and threw it down. "You have got to know," he said, his face purple with passion, and he flung out his arm as though he would dash his fist into her face. But as he stood with his arm poised, there came a singular change upon his face. "Did you hear anything?" he asked in a whisper. All listened, and all heard in the quiet of the night a faint click, and after an interval they heard it again, and after another but shorter interval, yet once more. "That's the gate," said Wethermill, in a whisper of fear, and a pulse of hope stirred within Celia. He seized her wrists, crushed them together behind her, and swiftly fastened them once more. Adèle Rossignol sat down upon the floor, took the girl's feet upon her lap, and quietly wrenched off her shoes. "The light!" cried Wethermill in an agonized voice, and Hélène Vauquier flew across the room and turned it off. All three stood, holding their breath, straining their ears in the dark room. On the hard gravel of the drive outside, footsteps became faintly audible and grew louder and came near. Adèle whispered to Vauquier, "Has the girl a lover?" And Hélène Vauquier, even at that moment, laughed quietly. All Celia's heart and youth rose in revolt against her extremity. If she could only free her lips! The footsteps came round the corner of the house. They sounded on the drive outside the very window of this room. One cry, and she would be saved. She tossed back her head and tried to force the handkerchief out from between her teeth. But Wethermill's hand covered her mouth and held it closed. The footsteps stopped. A light shone for a moment outside. The very handle of the door was tried. Within a few yards, help was there. Help and life. Just a frail latticed wooden door stood between her and them. She tried to rise to her feet. Adèle Rossignol held her legs firmly. She was powerless. She sat with one desperate hope, that whoever it was who was in the garden, he would break in. Were it even another murderer, he might have more pity than the callous brutes who held her now. He could have no less. But the footsteps moved away. It was the withdrawal of all hope. Celia heard Wethermill behind her draw a long breath of relief. That seemed to Celia almost the cruelest part of the whole tragedy. They waited in the darkness until the faint click of the gate was heard once more. Then the light was turned up again. "We must go," said Wethermill. All the three of them were shaken. They stood looking at one another, white and trembling. They spoke in whispers. To get out of the room, to have done with the business, that had suddenly become their chief necessity. Adèle picked up the necklace and the rings from the satinwood table and put them into a pocket bag which was slung at her waist. "Hippolyte shall turn these things into money," she said. "He shall set about it tomorrow. We shall have to keep the girl now, until she tells us where the rest is hidden." "Yes, keep her," said Hélène. "We will come over to Geneva in a few days, as soon as we can. We will persuade her to tell." She glanced darkly at the girl. Celia shivered. "Yes, that's it," said Wethermill. "But don't harm her. She will tell of her own will. You will see. The delay won't hurt now. We can't come back and search for a little while." He was speaking in a quick, agitated voice, and Adèle agreed. The desire to be gone had killed even their fury at the loss of their prize. Sometime they would come back, but they would not search now. They were too unnerved. "Helene," said Wethermill, "get to bed. I'll come up with the chloroform and put you to sleep." Helene Vauquier hurried upstairs. It was part of her plan that she should be left alone in the villa, chloroformed. Thus only could suspicion be averted from herself. She did not shrink from the completion of the plan now. She went, the strange woman, without a tremor to her ordeal. Wethermill took the length of rope which had fixed Celia to the pillar. "I'll follow," he said, and as he turned he stumbled over the body of Madame Dauvray. With a shrill cry he kicked it out of his way and crept up the stairs. Adèle Rossignol quickly set the room in order. She removed the stool from its position in the recess and carried it to its place in the hall. She put Celia's shoes upon her feet, loosening the cord from her ankles. Then she looked about the floor and picked up here and there a scrap of cord. In the silence, the clock upon the mantel-shelf chimed the 11:15. She screwed the stopper on the flask of vitriol very carefully and put the flask away in her pocket. She went into the kitchen and fetched the key of the garage. She put her hat on her head. She even picked up and drew on her gloves, afraid lest she should leave them behind. And then Wethermill came down again. Adèle looked at him inquiringly. "It is all done," he said with a nod of the head. "I will bring the car down to the door, then I'll drive you to Geneva and come back with the car here." He cautiously opened the latticed door of the window, listened for a moment, and ran silently down the drive. Adèle closed the door again, but she did not bolt it. She came back into the room. She looked at Celia as she lay back upon the settee with a long glance of indecision. And then, to Celia's surprise, for she had given up all hope, the indecision in her eyes became pity. She suddenly ran across the room and knelt down before Celia. With quick and feverish hands she untied the cord which fastened the train of her skirt above her knees. At first Celia shrank away, fearing some new cruelty, but Adèle's voice came to her ears, speaking, and speaking with remorse. "I can't endure it," she whispered. "You are so young, too young to be killed." The tears were rolling down Celia's cheeks. Her face was pitiful and beseeching. "Don't look at me like that, for God's sake, child," Adèle went on, and she chafed the girl's ankles for a moment. "Can you stand?" she asked. Celia nodded her head gratefully. After all, then, she was not to die. It seemed to her hardly possible. But before she could rise, a subdued whir of machinery penetrated into the room, and the motor car came slowly to the front of the villa. "Keep still," said Adèle hurriedly, and she placed herself in front of Celia. Wethermill opened the wooden door, while Celia's heart raced in her bosom. "I will go down and open the gate," he whispered. "Are you ready?" "Yes." Wethermill disappeared, and this time he left the door open. Adèle helped Celia to her feet. For a moment she tottered, then she stood firm. "Now run," whispered Adèle. "Run, child, for your life." Celia did not stop to think whither she should run, or how she should escape from Wethermill's search. She could not ask that her lips and her hands might be freed. She had but a few seconds. She had one thought, to hide herself in the darkness of the garden. Celia fled across the room, sprang wildly over the sill, ran, tripped over her skirt, steadied herself, and was swung off the ground by the arms of Harry Wethermill. "There we are," he said with his shrill, wavering laugh. "I opened the gate before." And suddenly Celia hung inert in his arms. The light went out in the salon. Adèle Rossignol, carrying Celia's cloak, stepped out at the side of the window. "She has fainted," said Wethermill. "Wipe the mould off her shoes, and off yours too, carefully. I don't want them to think that this car has been out of the garage at all." Adèle stooped and obeyed. Wethermill opened the door of the car and flung Celia into a seat. Adèle followed and took her seat opposite the girl. Wethermill stepped carefully again onto the grass, and with the toe of his shoe scraped up and ploughed the impressions which he and Adèle Rossignol had made on the ground, leaving those which Celia had made. He came back to the window. Then he took the chauffeur's seat and the car glided silently down the drive and out by the gate. As soon as it was on the road, it stopped. In an instant, Adèle Rossignol's head was out of the window. "What is it?" she exclaimed in fear. Wethermill pointed to the roof. He had left the light burning in Hélène Vauquier's room. "We can't go back now," said Adèle in a frantic whisper. "No, it is over. I daren't go back." And Wethermill jammed down the lever. The car sprang forward, and humming steadily over the white road, devoured the miles. But they had made their one mistake. End of chapter 19. Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. The Geneva Road. The car had nearly reached Annecy before Celia woke to consciousness, and even then she was dazed. She was only aware that she was in the motor car and traveling at a great speed. She lay back, drinking in the fresh air. Then she moved, and with the movement came to her recollection and the sense of pain. Her arms and wrists were still bound behind her, and the cords hurt her like hot wires. Her mouth, however, and her feet were free. She started forward, and Adèle Rossignol spoke sternly from the seat opposite. "Keep still. I am holding the flask in my hand. If you scream, if you make a movement to escape, I shall fling the vitriol in your face," she said. Celia shrank back, shivering. I won't," she whispered piteously. Her spirit was broken by the horrors of the night's adventure. She lay back and cried quietly in the darkness of the carriage. The car dashed through Annecy. It seemed incredible to Celia that less than 6 hours ago she had been dining with Madame Dauvray and the woman opposite who was now her jailer. Madame Dauvray lay dead in the little salon, and she herself, she dared not think what lay in front of her. She was to be persuaded, that was the word, to tell what she did not know. Meanwhile her name would be execrated through Aix as the murderess of the woman who had saved her. Then suddenly the car stopped. There were lights outside. Celia heard voices. A man was speaking to Wethermill. She started and saw Adèle Tass's arm flash upwards. She sank back in terror, and the car rolled on into the darkness. Adèle Tasse drew a breath of relief. The one point of danger had been passed. They had crossed the Pont de la Caille. They were in Switzerland. Some long while afterwards the car slackened its speed. By the side of it Celia heard the sound of wheels and of the hoofs of a horse. A single horsed closed landau had been caught up as it jogged along the road. The motor car stopped. Close by the side of it the driver of the landau reined in his horse. Wethermill jumped down from the chauffeur's seat, opened the door of the landau, and then put his head in at the window of the car. "Are you ready? Be quick." Adèle turned to Celia. "Not a word, remember." Wethermill flung open the door of the car. Adèle took the girl's feet and drew them down to the step of the car. Then she pushed her out. Wethermill caught her in his arms and carried her to the landau. Celia dared not cry out. Her hands were helpless, her face at the mercy of that grim flask. Just ahead of them the lights of Geneva were visible, and from the lights a silver radiance overspread a patch of sky. Wethermill placed her in the landau. Adèle sprang in behind her and closed the door. The transfer had taken no more than a few seconds. The landau jogged into Geneva. The motor turned and sped back over the 50 miles of empty road to Aix. As the motor car rolled away, courage returned for a moment to Celia. The man, the murderer, had gone. She was alone with Adèle Rossignol in a carriage moving no faster than an ordinary trot. Her ankles were free. The gag had been taken from her lips. If only she could free her hands and choose a moment when Adèle was off her guard, she might open the door and spring out onto the road. She saw Adèle draw down the blinds of the carriage, and very carefully, very secretly, Celia began to work her hands behind her. She was an adept. No movement was visible, but on the other hand, no success was obtained. The knots had been too cunningly tied. And then Madame Rossignol touched a button at her side in the leather of the carriage. The touch turned on a tiny lamp in the roof of the carriage, and she raised a warning hand to Celia. Now keep very quiet." Right through the empty streets of Geneva the landau was quietly driven. Adèle had peeped from time to time under the blind. There were few people in the streets. Once or twice a sergent de ville was seen under the light of a lamp. Celia dared not cry out. Over against her, persistently watching her, Adèle Rossignol sat with the open flask clenched in her hand, and from the vitriol Celia shrank with an overwhelming terror. The carriage drove out from the town along the western edge of the lake. "Now listen," said Adèle. "As soon as the landau stops, the door of the house opposite to which it stops will open. I shall open the carriage door myself, and you will get out. You must stand close by the carriage door until I have got out. I shall hold this flask ready in my hand. As soon as I am out, you will run across the pavement into the house. You won't speak or scream." Adèle Rossignol turned out the lamp, and 10 minutes later the carriage passed down the little street and attracted Madame Gobin's notice. Marthe Gobin had lit no light in her room. Adèle Rossignol peered out of the carriage. She saw houses in darkness. She could not see the busybody's face watching the landau from a dark window. She cut the cords which fastened the girl's hands. The carriage stopped. She opened the door. Celia sprang out onto the pavement. She sprang so quickly that Adèle Rossignol caught and held the train of her dress. But it was the fear of the vitriol which had made her spring so nimbly. It was that, too, which made her run so lightly and quickly into the house. The old woman who acted as servant, Jeanne Tasse, received her. Celia offered no resistance. The fear of vitriol had made her supple as a glove. Jeanne hurried her down the stairs into the little parlour at the back of the house where supper was laid, and pushed her into a chair. Celia let her arms fall forward on the table. She had no hope now. She was friendless and alone in a den of murderers who meant first to torture, then to kill her. She would be held up to execration as a murderess. No one would know how she had died or what she had suffered. She was in pain and her throat burned. She buried her face in her arms and sobbed. All her body shook with her sobbing. Jeanne Rossignol took no notice. She treated Célie just as the others had done. Celia was La Petite, against whom she had no animosity, by whom she was not to be touched to any tenderness. La Petite had unconsciously played her useful part in their crime, but her use was ended now, and they would deal with her accordingly. She removed the girl's hat and cloak and tossed them aside. "Now, stay quiet until we are ready for you," she said. And Celia, lifting her head, said in a whisper, "Water." The old woman poured some from a jug and held the glass to Celia's lips. "Thank you," whispered Celia gratefully, and Adèle came into the room. She told the story of the night to Jeanne, and afterwards to Hippolyte when he joined them. "And nothing gained!" cried the older woman furiously. "And we have hardly a 5-franc piece in the house." "Yes, something," said Adèle. "A necklace, a good one, some good rings and bracelets. And we shall find out where the rest is hid. From her." And she nodded at Celia. The three people ate their supper, and while they ate it discussed Celia's fate. She was lying with her head bowed upon her arms at the same table, within a foot of them, but they made no more of her presence than if she had been an old shoe. Only once did one of them speak to her. "Stop your whimpering," said Hippolyte roughly. "We can hardly hear ourselves talk." He was for finishing with the business altogether tonight. "It's a mistake," he said. "There's been a bungle, and the sooner we are rid of it the better. There's a boat at the bottom of the garden." Celia listened and shuddered. He would have no more compunction over drowning her than he would have had over drowning a blind kitten. "It's cursed luck," he said, "but we have got the necklace. That's something. That's our share, do you see? The young spark can look for the rest." But Helene Vauquier's wish prevailed. She was the leader. They would keep the girl until she came to Geneva. They took her upstairs into the big bedroom overlooking the lake. Adèle opened the door of the closet where a truckle bed stood and thrust the girl in. "This is my room," she said warningly, pointing to the bedroom. "Take care I hear no noise. You might shout yourself hoarse, my pretty one. No one else would hear you, but I should, and afterwards we should no longer be able to call you my pretty one, eh?" and with a horrible playfulness she pinched the girl's cheek. Then, with old Jeanne's help, she stripped Celia and told her to get into bed. "I'll give her something to keep her quiet," said Adèle, and she fetched her morphia needle and injected a dose into Celia's arm. Then they took her clothes away and left her in the darkness. She heard the key turn in the lock, and a moment after the sound of the bedstead being drawn across the doorway, but she heard no more, for almost immediately she fell asleep. She was awakened sometime the next day by the door opening. Old Jeanne Tasse brought her in a jug of water and a roll of bread, and locked her up again, and a long time afterwards she brought her another supply. Yet another day had gone, but in that dark cupboard Celia had no means of judging time. In the afternoon the newspaper came out with the announcement that Madame Dauvray's jewellery had been discovered under the boards. Hippolyte brought in the newspaper, and cursing their stupidity, they sat down to decide upon Celia's fate. That, however, was soon arranged. They would dress her in everything which she wore when she came, so that no trace of her might be discovered. They would give her another dose of morphia, sew her up in a sack as soon as she was unconscious, row her far out onto the lake, and sink her with a weight attached. They dragged her out from the cupboard, always with the threat of that bright aluminium flask before her eyes. She fell upon her knees, imploring their pity, with tears running down her cheeks, but they sewed the strip of sacking over her face so that she should see nothing of their preparations. They flung her on the sofa, secured as Hanaud had found her, and leaving her in the old woman's charge, sent down Adèle for her needle and Hippolyte to get ready the boat. As Hippolyte opened the door, he saw the launch of the chef de la Sûreté glide along the bank. End of chapter 20. One of At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. Hanaud Explains. This is the story as Mr. Ricardo wrote it out from the statement of Celia herself and the confession of Adèle Rossignol. Obscurities which had puzzled him were made clear, but he was still unaware how Hanaud had worked out the solution. "You promised me that you would explain," he said, when they were both together after the trial was over at Aix. The two men had just finished luncheon at the Cercle and were sitting over their coffee. Hanaud lighted a cigar. "There were difficulties, of course," he said. "The crime was so carefully planned. The little details, such as the footprints, the absence of any mud from the girl's shoes in the carriage of the motor car, the dinner at Annecy, the purchase of the cord, the want of any sign of a struggle in the little salon, were all carefully thought out. Had not one little accident happened, and one little mistake been made in consequence, I doubt if we should have laid our hands upon one of the gang. We might have suspected Wethermill, we should hardly have secured him, and we should very likely never have known of the Tasse family. That mistake was, as you no doubt are fully aware, the failure of Wethermill to discover Madame Dauvray's jewels," said Ricardo at once. "No, my friend," answered Hanaud. "That made them keep Mademoiselle Celie alive. It enabled us to save her when we had discovered the whereabouts of the gang. It did not help us very much to lay our hands on them. No, the little accident which happened was the entrance of our friend Perrichet into the garden while the murderers were still in the room. Imagine that scene, Monsieur Ricardo. The rage of the murderers at their inability to discover the plunder for which they had risked their necks. The old woman crumpled up on the floor against the wall. The girl writing laboriously with fettered arms, I do not know, under threats of torture. And then, in the stillness of the night, the clear, tiny click of the gate and the measured, relentless footsteps. No wonder they were terrified in that dark room. What would be their one thought? Why, to get away. To come back perhaps later, when Mademoiselle Celie should have told them what, by the way, she did not know, but in any case to get away now. So they made their little mistake, and in their hurry they left the light burning in the room of Helene Vauquier, and the murder was discovered 7 hours too soon for them." 7 hours? said Mr. Ricardo. "Yes, the household did not rise early. It was not until 7 that the charwoman came. It was she who was meant to discover the crime. By that time the motor car would have been back 3 hours ago in its garage. Servettaz, the chauffeur, would have returned from Chambéry sometime in the morning. He would have cleaned the car. He would have noticed that there was very little petrol in the tank, as there had been when he had left it on the day before. He would not have noticed that some of his many tins, which had been full yesterday, were empty today. We should not have discovered that about 4 in the morning the car was close to the Villa Rose, and that it had travelled, between midnight and 5 in the morning, 150 kilometres. "But you had already guessed Geneva," said Ricardo. "At luncheon, before the news came that the car was found, you had guessed it." "It was a shot," said Hanaud. "The absence of the car helped me to make it. It is a large city and not very far away, a likely place for people with the police at their heels to run to earth in. But if the car had been discovered in the garage, I should not have made that shot. Even then I had no particular conviction about Geneva. I really wished to see how Wethermill would take it. He was wonderful." He sprang up. He betrayed nothing but surprise. "You showed no less surprise than he did, my good friend. What I was looking for was one glance of fear. I did not get it." "Yet you suspected him. Even then you spoke of brains and audacity. You told him enough to hinder him from communicating with the red-haired woman in Geneva. You isolated him. Yes, you suspected him." "Let us take the case from the beginning. When you first came to me, as I told you, the commissaire had already been with me. There was an interesting piece of evidence already in his possession. Adolphe Ruel, who saw Wethermill and Vauquier together close by the Casino and overheard that cry of Wethermill's, 'It is true, I must have money,' had already been with his story to the commissaire. I knew it when Harry Wethermill came into the room to ask me to take up the case. That was a bold stroke, my friend. The chances were 100 to 1 that I should not interrupt my holiday to take up a case because of your little dinner party in London. Indeed, I should not have interrupted it had I not known Adolphe Ruel's story. As it was, I could not resist. Wethermill's very audacity charmed me. Oh yes, I felt that I must pit myself against him. So few criminals have spirit, Monsieur Ricardo. It is deplorable how few. But Wethermill, see in what a fine position he would have been if only I had refused. He himself had been the first to call upon the first detective in France. And his argument, he loved Mademoiselle Celie, therefore she must be innocent. How he stuck to it! People would have said, 'Love is blind,' and all the more they would have suspected Mademoiselle Celie. Yes, but they loved the blind lover. Therefore, all the more would it have been impossible for them to believe Harry Wethermill had any share in that grim crime." Mr. Ricardo drew his chair close in to the table. "I will confess to you," he said, "that I thought Mademoiselle Celie was an accomplice." "It is not surprising," said Hanaud. "Someone within the house was an accomplice. We start with that fact. The house had not been broken into. There was Mademoiselle Celie's record, as Helene Vauquier gave it to us, and a record obviously true. There was the fact that she had got rid of Servettaz. There was the maid upstairs, very ill from the chloroform. What more likely than that Mademoiselle Celie had arranged a séance, and then when the lights were out had admitted the murderer through that convenient glass door?" "There were, besides, the definite imprints of her shoes," said Mr. Ricardo. "Yes, but that is precisely where I began to feel sure that she was innocent," replied Hanaud dryly. "All the other footmarks had been so carefully scored and ploughed up that nothing could be made of them. Yet those little ones remained, so definite, so easily identified, and I began to wonder why these, too, had not been cut up and stamped over. The murderers had taken, you see, an excess of precaution to throw the presumption of guilt upon Mademoiselle Celie rather than upon Vauquier. However, there the footsteps were. Mademoiselle Celie had sprung from the room as I described to Wethermill. But I was puzzled. Then in the room I found the torn-up sheet of notepaper with the words "Je ne sais pas" in Mademoiselle's handwriting. The words might have been spirit writing. They might have meant anything. I put them away in my mind. But in the room the settee puzzled me. And again I was troubled, greatly troubled. Yes, I saw that." "And not you alone," said Hanaud with a smile. "Do you remember that loud cry Wethermill gave when we returned to the room and once more I stood before the settee? Oh, he turned it off very well. I had said that our criminals in France were not very gentle with their victims, and he pretended that it was in fear of what Mademoiselle Celie might be suffering which had torn that cry from his heart. But it was not so. He was afraid, deadly afraid, not for Mademoiselle Celie, but for himself. He was afraid that I had understood what these cushions had to tell me." "What did they tell you?" asked Ricardo. "You know now," said Hanaud. "There were two cushions, both indented, and indented in different ways. The one at the head was irregularly indented. Something shaped had pressed upon it. It might have been a face, it might not. And there was a little brown stain which was fresh, and which was blood. The second cushion had two separate impressions, and between them the cushion was forced up in a thin ridge, and these impressions were more definite. I measured the distance between the two cushions, and I found this, that supposing, and it was a large supposition, the cushions had not been moved since those impressions were made, a girl of Mademoiselle Celie's height, lying stretched out upon the sofa, would have her face pressing down upon one cushion and her feet and insteps upon the other. Now, the impressions upon the second cushion and the thin ridge between them were just the impressions which might have been made by a pair of shoes held close together. But that would not be a natural attitude for anyone, and the mark upon the head cushion was very deep. Supposing that my conjectures were true, then a woman would only lie like that because she was helpless, because she had been flung there, because she could not lift herself, because, in a word, her hands were tied behind her back and her feet fastened together. Well, then, follow this train of reasoning, my friend. Suppose my conjectures, and we had nothing but conjectures to build upon, were true. The woman flung upon the sofa could not be Helene Vauquier, for she would have said so. She could have had no reason for concealment. But it must be Mademoiselle Celie. There was the slit in the one cushion and the stain on the other, which of course I had not accounted for. There was still, too, the puzzle of the footsteps outside the glass doors. If Mademoiselle Celie had been bound upon the sofa, how came she to run with her limbs free from the house? There was a question not easy to answer. "Yes," said Mr. Ricardo. "Yes, but there was also another question. Suppose that Mademoiselle Celie was, after all, the victim, not the accomplice. Suppose she had been flung tied upon the sofa. Suppose that somehow the imprint of her shoes upon the ground had been made, and that she had afterwards been carried away, so that the maid might be cleared of all complicity. In that case it became intelligible why the other footprints were scored out and hers left. The presumption of guilt would fall upon her. There would be proof that she ran hurriedly from the room and sprang into a motor car of her own free will. But again, if that theory were true, then Helene Vauquier was the accomplice, and not Mademoiselle Celie." "I follow that." "Then I found an interesting piece of evidence with regard to the strange woman who came. I picked up a long red hair, a very important piece of evidence, about which I thought it best to say nothing at all. It was not Mademoiselle Celie's hair, which is fair, nor Vauquier's, which is black, nor Madame Dauvray's, which is dyed brown, nor the charwoman's, which is grey. It was, therefore, the visitor's. Well, we went upstairs to Mademoiselle Celie's room." "Yes," said Mr. Ricardo eagerly, "we are coming to the pot of cream." In that room we learnt that Helene Vauquier, at her own request, had already paid it a visit. It is true the commissaire said that he had kept his eye on her the whole time. But none the less, from the window, he saw me coming down the road, and that he could not have done, as I made sure, unless he had turned his back upon Vauquier and leaned out of the window. Now, at the time, I had an open mind about Vauquier. On the whole, I was inclined to think she had no share in the affair. But either she or Mademoiselle Celie had, and perhaps both. But one of them, yes, that was sure. Therefore I asked what drawers she touched after the commissaire had leaned out of the window, for if she had any motive in wishing to visit the room, she would have satisfied it when the commissaire's back was turned. He pointed to a drawer, and I took out a dress and shook it, thinking that she may have wished to hide something. But nothing fell out. On the other hand, however, I saw some quite fresh grease marks made by fingers, and the marks were wet. I began to ask myself how it was that Helene Vauquier, who had just been helped to dress by the nurse, had grease upon her fingers. Then I looked at a drawer which she had examined first of all. There were no grease marks on the clothes she had turned over before the commissaire leaned out of the window. Therefore it followed that during the few seconds when he was watching me she had touched grease. I looked about the room, and there on the dressing-table, close by the chest of drawers, was a pot of cold cream. That was the grease Helene Vauquier had touched. And why, if not to hide some small thing in it, which firstly she dared not keep in her own room, which secondly she wished to hide in the room of Mademoiselle Celie, and which thirdly she had not had an opportunity to hide before? Now, bear those three conditions in mind, and tell me what the small thing was. Mr. Ricardo nodded his head. "I know now," he said. "You told me. The earrings of Mademoiselle Celie. But I should not have guessed it at the time." "Nor could I, at the time," said Hanaud. "I kept my open mind about Helene Vauquier, but I locked the door and took the key. Then we went and heard Vauquier's story. The story was clever, because so much of it was obviously, indisputably true. The account of the séances, of Madame Dauvray's superstitions, her desire for an interview with Madame de Montespan, such details are not invented. It was interesting, too, to know that there had been a séance planned for that night. The method of the murder began to be clear. So far she spoke the truth. But then she lied. Yes, she lied, and it was a bad lie, my friend. She told us that the strange woman Adèle had black hair. Now, I carried in my pocket-book proof that that woman's hair was red. Why did she lie, except to make impossible the identification of that strange visitor? That was the first false step taken by Helene Vauquier. Now let us take the second. I thought nothing of her rancour against Mademoiselle Celie. To me it was all very natural. She, the hard peasant woman, no longer young, who had been for years the confidential servant of Madame Dauvray, and had no doubt taken her levy from the impostors who preyed upon her credulous mistress. Certainly she would hate this young and pretty outcast, whom she has to wait upon, whose hair she has to dress. Vauquier, she would hate her. But if by any chance she were in the plot, and the lie seemed to show she was, then the séances showed me new possibilities. For Helene used to help Mademoiselle Celie. Suppose that the séance had taken place, that the sceptical visitor with the red hair professed herself dissatisfied with Vauquier's method of testing the medium, had suggested another way. Mademoiselle Celie could not object, and there she would be neatly and securely packed up beyond the power of offering any resistance before she could have a suspicion that things were wrong. It would be an easy little comedy to play, and if that were true, why, there were my sofa cushions, partly explained. "Yes, I see," cried Ricardo with enthusiasm. "You are wonderful." Hanaud was not displeased with his companion's enthusiasm. "But wait a moment. We have only conjecture so far, and one fact, that Helene Vauquier lied about the colour of the strange woman's hair. Now we get another fact. Mademoiselle Celie was wearing buckles on her shoes, and there is my slit in the sofa cushions. For when she is flung onto the sofa, what will she do? She will kick, she will struggle. Of course it is conjecture. I do not as yet hold pig-headedly to it. I am not yet sure that Mademoiselle Celie is innocent. I am willing at any moment to admit that the facts contradict my theory. But on the contrary, each fact that I discover helps it to take shape. Now I come to Helene Vauquier's second mistake. On the evening when you saw Mademoiselle Celie in the garden behind the baccarat rooms, you noticed that she wore no jewellery except a pair of diamond eardrops. In the photograph of her which Wethermill showed me, again she was wearing them. Is it not therefore probable that she usually wore them? When I examined her room, I found the case for those earrings. The case was empty. It was natural, then, to infer that she was wearing them when she came down to the séance. Yes? Well, I read a description, a carefully written description, of the missing girl made by Helene Vauquier after an examination of the girl's wardrobe. There was no mention of the earrings. So I asked her, was she not wearing them? Helene Vauquier was taken by surprise. How should I know anything of Mademoiselle Celie's earrings? She hesitated. She did not quite know what answer to make. Now why? Since she herself dressed Mademoiselle Celie and remembers so very well all she wore, why does she hesitate? Well, there is a reason. She does not know how much I know about those diamond eardrops. She is not sure whether we have not dipped into that pot of cold cream and found them. Yet, without knowing, she cannot answer. So now we come back to our pot of cold cream. "Yes," cried Mr. Ricardo, "they were there." "Wait a bit," said Hanaud. "Let us see how it works out. Remember the conditions. Vauquier has some small thing which he must hide, and which he wishes to hide in Mademoiselle Celie's room, for she admitted that it was her suggestion that she should look through Mademoiselle's wardrobe. For what reason does she choose the girl's room, except that if the thing were discovered, that would be the natural place for it? It is, then, something belonging to Mademoiselle Celie. There was a second condition we laid down. It was something Vauquier had not been able to hide before. It came then into her possession last night. Why could she not hide it last night? Because she was not alone. There were the man and the woman, her accomplices. It was something, then, which she was concerned in hiding from them. It is not rash to guess, then, that it was some piece of the plunder of which the other two would have claimed their share, and a piece of plunder belonging to Mademoiselle Celie. Well, she has nothing but the diamond eardrops. Suppose Vauquier is left alone to guard Mademoiselle Celie, while the other two ransack Madame Dauvray's room. She sees her chance. The girl cannot stir hand or foot to save herself. Vauquier tears the eardrops in a hurry from her ears, and there I have my drop of blood just where I should expect it to be. But now follow this. Vauquier hides the earrings in her pocket. She goes to bed in order to be chloroformed. She knows that it is very possible that her room will be searched before she regains consciousness, or before she is well enough to move. There is only one place to hide them in, only one place where they will be safe, in bed with her. But in the morning she must get rid of them, and a nurse is with her. Hence the excuse to go to Mademoiselle Celie's room. If the eardrops are found in the pot of cold cream, it would only be thought that Mademoiselle Celie had herself hidden them there for safety. Again, it is conjecture, and I wish to make sure. So I tell Vauquier she can go away, and I leave her unwatched. I have her driven to the depot instead of to her friends, and searched. Upon her is found the pot of cream, and in the cream Mademoiselle Celie's eardrops. She has slipped into Mademoiselle Celie's room, as, if my theory was correct, she would be sure to do, and put the pot of cream into her pocket. So now I am fairly sure that she is concerned in the murder. We then went to Madame Dauvray's room and discovered her brilliants and her ornaments. At once the meaning of that agitated piece of handwriting of Mademoiselle Celie's becomes clear. She is asked where the jewels are hidden. She cannot answer, for her mouth, of course, is stopped. She has to write. Thus my conjectures get more and more support. And mind this, one of the two women is guilty, Celie or Vauquier. My discoveries all fit in with the theory of Celie's innocence. But there remain the footprints, for which I found no explanation. You will remember I made you all promise silence as to the finding of Madame Dauvray's jewellery, for I thought, if they have taken the girl away so that suspicion may fall on her and not on Vauquier, they mean to dispose of her. But they may keep her so long as they have a chance of finding out from her Madame Dauvray's hiding place. It was a small chance, but our only one. The moment the discovery of the jewellery was published, the girl's fate was sealed, were my theory true. Then came our advertisement and Madame Gobin's written testimony. There was one small point of interest which I will take first. Her statement that Adèle was the Christian name of the woman with the red hair, that the old woman who was the servant in that house in the suburb of Geneva called her Adèle, just simply Adèle. That interested me, for Helene Vauquier had called her Adèle too when she was describing to us the unknown visitor. Adèle was what Madame Dauvray called her. "Yes," said Ricardo. "Helene Vauquier made a slip there. She should have given her a false name." Hanaud nodded. "It is the one slip she made in the whole of the business. Nor did she recover herself very cleverly. For when the Commissaire pounced upon the name, she at once modified her words. She only thought now that the name was Adèle, or something like it. But when I went on to suggest that the name in any case would be a false one, at once she went back upon her modifications. And now she was sure that Adèle was the name used. I remembered her hesitation when I read Marthe Gobin's letter. They helped to confirm me in my theory that she was in the plot, and they made me very sure that it was an Adèle for whom we had to look. So far, well. But other statements in the letter puzzled me. For instance, she ran lightly and quickly across the pavement into the house, as though she were afraid to be seen. Those were the words, and the woman was obviously honest. What became of my theory, then? The girl was free to run, free to stoop and pick up the train of her gown in her hand, free to shout for help in the open street if she wanted help? No, that I could not explain until that afternoon, when I saw Mademoiselle Celie's terror-stricken eyes fixed upon that flask as Le Maire poured a little out and burned a hole in the sack. Then I understood well enough the fear of vitriol. Hanaud gave an uneasy shudder. And it is enough to make anyone afraid. That I can tell you. No wonder she lay still as a mouse upon the sofa in the bedroom. No wonder she ran quickly into the house. Well, there you have the explanation. I had only my theory to work upon even after Madame Gobin's evidence. But as it happened, it was the right one. Meanwhile, of course, I made my inquiries into Wethermill's circumstances. My good friends in England helped me. They were precarious. He owed money in Aix, money at his hotel. We knew from the motor car that the man we were searching for had returned to Aix. Things began to look black for Wethermill. Then you gave me a little piece of information." "I?" exclaimed Ricardo with a start. "Yes, you told me that you walked up to the hotel with Harry Wethermill on the night of the murder and separated just before 10. A glance into his rooms, which I had. You will remember that when we discovered the motor car, I suggested that we should go to Harry Wethermill's rooms and talk it over. That glance enabled me to see that he could very easily have got out of his room onto the veranda below and escaped from the hotel by the garden quite unseen. For you will remember that whereas your rooms look out to the front and onto the slope of Mont Revard, Wethermill's look out over the garden and the town of Aix. In a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes he could have reached the Villa Rose. He could have been in the salon before 10:30, and that is just the hour which suited me perfectly. And as he got out unnoticed, so he could return. So he did return. My friend, there are some interesting marks upon the window-sill of Wethermill's room and upon the pillar just beneath it. Take a look, Monsieur Ricardo, when you return to your hotel. But that was not all. We talked of Geneva in Mr. Wethermill's room, and of the distance between Geneva and Aix. Do you remember that?" "Yes," replied Ricardo. "Do you remember, too, that I asked him for a road book?" "Yes, to make sure of the distance. I do." "Ah, but it was not to make sure of the distance that I asked for the road book, my friend. I asked in order to find out whether Harry Wethermill had a road book at all, which gave a plan of the roads between here and Geneva. And he had. He handed it to me at once and quite naturally. I hope that I took it calmly, but I was not at all calm inside, for it was a new road book, which, by the way, he bought a week before, and I was asking myself all the while, now, what was I asking myself, Monsieur Ricardo?" "No," said Ricardo with a smile. "I'm growing wary. I will not tell you what you were asking yourself, Monsieur Hanaud, for even were I right, you would make out that I was wrong, and leap upon me with injuries and gibes. No, you shall drink your coffee and tell me of your own accord." "Well," said Hanaud, laughing, "I will tell you. I was asking myself, why does a man who owns no motor car, who hires no motor car, go out into Aix and buy an automobilist's road map? With what object? And I found it an interesting question. Mr. Harry Wethermill was not the man to go upon a walking tour, eh? Oh, I was obtaining evidence. But then came an overwhelming thing, the murder of Marthe Gobin. We know now how he did it. He walked beside the cab, put his head in at the window, asked, "Have you come in answer to the advertisement?" and stabbed her straight to the heart through her dress. The dress and the weapon which he used would save him from being stained with her blood. He was in your room that morning when we were at the station. As I told you, he left his glove behind. He was searching for a telegram in answer to your advertisement. Or he came to sound you. He had already received his telegram from Hippolyte. He was like a fox in a cage, snapping at everyone, twisting vainly this way and that way, risking everything and every one to save his precious neck. Marthe Gobin was in the way. She is killed. Mademoiselle Celie is a danger. So Mademoiselle Celie must be suppressed. And off goes a telegram to the Geneva paper, handed in by a waiter from the café at the station of Chambéry before 5 o'clock. Wethermill went to Chambéry that afternoon when we went to Geneva. Once we could get him on the run, once we could so harry and bustle him that he must take risks, why, we had him. And that afternoon he had to take them. So that even before Marthe Gobin was killed, you were sure that Wethermill was the murderer? Hanaud's face clouded over. You put your finger on a sore place, Monsieur Ricardo. I was sure, but I still wanted evidence to convict. I left him free, hoping for that evidence. I left him free, hoping that he would commit himself. He did, but, well, let us talk of someone else. What of Mademoiselle Celie? Ricardo drew a letter from his pocket. I have a sister in London, a widow, he said. She is kind. I, too, have been thinking of what will become of Mademoiselle Celie. I wrote to my sister, and here is a reply. Mademoiselle Celie will be very welcome. Hanaud stretched out his hand and shook Ricardo's warmly. She will not, I think, be for very long a burden. She is young. She will recover from this shock. She is very pretty, very gentle. If no one comes forward whom she loves, and who loves her, yes, I myself, who was her papa for one night, will be her husband forever. He laughed inordinately at his own joke. It was a habit of Monsieur Hanaud's. Then he said gravely, "But I am glad, Monsieur Ricardo, for Mademoiselle Celie's sake, that I came to your amusing dinner party in London." Mr. Ricardo was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "And what will happen to the condemned?" "To the women? Imprisonment for life." "And to the man?" Hanaud shrugged his shoulders. "Perhaps the guillotine. Perhaps New Caledonia. How can I say? I am not the President of the Republic." End of chapter 21. End of At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason.